Good evening, and welcome to the History Dreaming. Tonight we return to the waters, to a time when the earth itself seemed to breathe and drown. Across every continent, legends tell the same story, a flood that swallowed mountains, cities, and memory. From Noah's Ark to the Epic of Gilgamesh, from Atlantis to the myths of India's Manu, humanity has never forgotten the night the sea rose. Was it a storm, a melting world, or something more cosmic? A whisper from the stars reshaping everything we knew. 12,000 years have passed, yet the water still speaks softly beneath our dreams. So close your eyes and let the tide pull you back through time. This is History for Sleep, where the past drifts quietly beneath the waves. I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments. The world once breathed in harmony with itself. The forests spoke in ancient tones, their leaves rustling with languages that no longer exist. Mountains shimmered with morning mist, their roots sunk deep into sleeping fire. Rivers moved like silver serpents through valleys of quiet abundance. The people of that age did not chase the sky, they listened to it. Each dawn was an offering, each night a hymn. The air was warm, thick with unseen power. And in that stillness before history began, the earth sang. Their cities did not rise in defiance of nature, but flowed with it. Walls curved like riverbeds, temples faced the wind, and streets were mapped according to the stars. The people of Lemuria, Atlantis, and Mu built with intuition rather than instruction. They shaped stone to echo the pulse of the earth, so that every step within their cities resonated with the planet's breath. At night their towers glowed softly, fueled not by flame or oil, but by what they called the breath of the earth, a living light drawn from the world's own heart. The nights of that era were unlike ours. Constellations danced differently then. Some have since vanished into cosmic silence. The skies were alive, scattered with blue fire that moved like waves upon an invisible ocean. These ancient astronomers did not merely watch the heavens, they conversed with them. Every flicker of light carried a message, every star a memory. They read those messages with devotion, carving celestial maps into crystal tablets. The stars were their scripture, and the cosmos their cathedral. Among them walked the keepers, neither rulers nor priests, but guardians of balance. They wore robes woven from sunlight and silence, and they governed not through command but through understanding. The keepers believed that every sound, every gesture, even every breath, could shift the harmony of the world. So they spoke sparingly, moved slowly, and listened always. To the hum of roots, to the rhythm of tides, to the faint tremor that lived beneath the soil where the old gods still dreamed. There was no separation between man and nature in that forgotten age. The forests were extensions of their bodies, the winds their thoughts made visible. They understood that the world was alive, not metaphorically, but truly. Mountains had pulse, rivers remembered. Fire could think. Every ritual, every song was a dialogue with the living earth. They built not to claim dominion, but to preserve connection. Their architecture was prayer, their daily labor a form of worship without words. And yet, even in paradise, there was unease. The sky had begun to change. A single scar appeared among the constellations, a wandering red light that defied the patterns known to them. The keepers gathered atop the high terraces of Lemuria, their obsidian instruments trembling under unseen pressure. The air grew colder. The rhythm of the tides faltered. Animals began migrating out of season, as though following orders whispered by distant storms. The world, once perfectly tuned, had missed a beat. The sages watched the heavens for centuries. The Red Wanderer returned again and again, each time closer, each time brighter. Some said it was the eye of a sleeping god. Others called it the herald of fire. But most dismissed the warning signs, for how could an age so blessed ever end? How could the eternal drown? They clung to beauty as if it were immortal, blind to the quiet unraveling beneath their feet. The oceans stirred restlessly. The ice whispered. The world prepared to turn its page. The elders spoke then of cycles, the great breath of the earth. They taught that creation and destruction were one continuous exhalation, one eternal rhythm. When a world forgot to listen, the earth would remind it through storm and silence, And so the flood was not punishment, but memory returning. Each deluge was a reset, a cleansing of noise, a rebirth of harmony. These were truths whispered in temples and carved on the hidden sides of pillars, meant only for those who still remembered the original song. And as that world dimmed, its people gathered for one last rite. On mountaintops and in caverns, they sang the lament of the first world. Their voices wove through wind and stone, becoming part of the planet's echo. They did not beg for mercy, they offered remembrance. When the final note faded, the air itself seemed to pause, holding its breath before the plunge. The song sank beneath the waves, but not all sound dies. Even now, in the depths of the ocean, something hums faintly, an old vibration waiting to be heard again. Beneath the radiant towers and silent gardens, the people of that age built with a precision lost to time. They shaped granite as if it were clay, carving it so finely that even the smallest seams defied centuries of erosion. Their temples were not monuments to gods, but instruments, machines of prayer designed to resonate with the planet's unseen harmonics. When the wind passed through them, the walls would hum softly, echoing the same frequency as the pulse of the earth below. Light itself became sacred geometry, streaming through openings aligned with solstice suns and lunar tides. Every stone was a syllable in a vast cosmic sentence that no longer has a reader. They called themselves not builders, but tenders of radiance. Their knowledge of energy came not from conquest, but from listening. They claimed that the earth possessed a living current that flowed through mountains, rivers, and even human blood. By aligning their bodies, tools, and dwellings with that invisible tide, they drew power without flame, heat without smoke. It was said that certain chambers deep within their cities glowed with light that never dimmed. Light fed not by oil, but by the will of harmony itself. The keepers taught that to understand energy was to understand emotion, for both followed the same patterns of rhythm and release. Music guided their science. The air inside their halls was tuned like a string, and every note had weight, texture, color. Chants were measured in vibrations, each capable of moving matter in ways that bordered on the miraculous. To raise a stone was not an act of muscle, but of sound. The priests sang to the pillars, and the pillars obeyed. Even the animals joined the resonance. Herds moved in synchrony when the right tones were struck. The line between physics and prayer dissolved. To them, sound was not entertainment. It was the voice of the divine, a technology of the soul. Their libraries were living organisms, not shelves and parchment, but crystalline archives that responded to touch and memory. When one placed a hand upon their surface, the crystal would vibrate, replaying the stored song of the ancient world. History was not read, it was heard. And only the pure of heart could receive it clearly, for emotion could distort the resonance. This was their form of protection, knowledge guarded not by locks, but by the harmony of the seeker's spirit. If one's intention faltered, the record would fade into static, leaving only silence. In the heart of Atlantis stood the great Hall of Mirrors, said to reflect not faces, but thoughts. Walls of polished stone shimmered with images of the past and possibilities of the future. The keepers gathered there each equinox to measure the balance between sky and sea. They knew that every age carried within it the seed of its ending, and they watched for that first tremor, the subtle shift when abundance turns to excess, when reverence turns to pride. It was pride that frightened them most. Pride, they said, was the crack through which darkness first enters light. Across the ocean in Lemuria's mountain temples, the priest-scientists studied the voice of water. They believed that sound and water were sisters, both shaped by vibration. They built vast resonant pools to amplify the songs of the deep, decoding messages carried from the sea's heart. Some claimed that they could hear the Earth's molten core singing back to them, warning of pressure building, of ice preparing to fall. Their carvings depict waves taller than mountains and skies shattered by fire. But even with these omens before them, the world above continued in peace. Humanity, once so attuned to rhythm, began to lose tempo. Trade between the ancient continents flourished. Silver from the Western Isles, gold from the inland rivers, crystals from the sea caves, all flowed across calm oceans under ships that glided without sails. These vessels, according to the oldest legends, were guided by sound alone. Pilots tuned bronze instruments that hummed in the key of the wind, and the waters obeyed. The seas were their highways, and the stars their compass. But beneath the serenity of that golden age, something ancient stirred, a low vibration rising from the ocean floor, so deep it could only be felt in dreams. The keepers warned that the pulse was changing. The great ley lines of the planet, the arteries of the earth, were swelling. The hum beneath the soil grew erratic, as if something vast and invisible was struggling to breathe. They gathered in secret, debating whether to silence the towers, to release the stored light back into the ground. But pride had already taken root. Many believed the light could not harm them, that the gods would protect what they had built. In their overconfidence, they let the towers sing louder. The earth listened and prepared its reply. And so, the architects of light continued their work, unaware that they were writing the final stanza of their civilization. Their towers gleamed brighter than ever, their chants louder, their pride deeper. But beauty without humility becomes noise. The harmony began to fracture, the air grew heavy, the stars dimmed. Somewhere far to the north, a glacier cracked like a divine drumbeat. The first note of the world's great unmaking had been struck, though none yet recognized the sound. It began with a silence no one could explain. The birds that once sang before dawn now waited, as if listening for something greater than the sun. The winds that carried warmth from the southern seas grew sharp, whispering through the temples like restless ghosts. Across the continents, the keepers felt a pulse beneath their feet, a faint tremor that passed through stone and blood alike. They gathered at dusk, standing upon terraces that overlooked silver horizons, and watched as the heavens unveiled a new wound, a streak of crimson that bled across the night. It was no star. It moved against the tides of the cosmos, trailing dust like the tail of an ancient serpent. The sky had begun to remember. In Lemuria, the astronomer priests adjusted their obsidian mirrors to trace its movement. They saw its reflection tremble across the surface of sacred pools and marked its path in spirals upon clay tablets. The red wanderer grew brighter each night, casting strange light upon the temples, painting shadows that moved even when the torches stood still. Farmers began to find their crops withered at the edges, as though scorched by unseen fire. The seas, once calm and silver, turned restless, breathing louder against the coasts. Whales beached themselves in confusion, and the stars above them seemed to pulse in sympathy. The old songs, sung for centuries to keep the balance, began to sound hollow. In Atlantis, the great hall of mirrors no longer showed the reflections of peace. When the keepers entered its chambers, the polished walls shimmered with images of waves, of lightning that split the ocean, of towers collapsing beneath white foam. Some fled in denial, calling it illusion. Others fell to their knees, recognizing it as prophecy. They summoned the oldest of their kind, the silent ones who had withdrawn to the deep mountains long ago. When they arrived, wrapped in smoke and age, they spoke a single sentence that chilled the room. The heavens are leaning. For they knew the constellations had shifted. The axis of the world had begun to tilt. From the mountains of the east came fire. First a dull glow, then pillars of flame that reached toward the clouds. The snowcaps melted in a single season, and rivers turned violent, tearing through valleys that had never known flood. The sky burned strange colors at sunset, violet, then green, then the pale blue of dying embers. Even the moon seemed uneasy, swelling and shrinking without reason. The keepers measured every change, recording the rhythms like physicians taking the pulse of a fevered god. But no cure could be found. The heavens had already chosen their course, and humanity's harmony was too faint to sway it. Rumors spread across the lands like drifting smoke. Some said the gods were returning to claim what man had forgotten. Others whispered that the sun itself had been wounded, bleeding through the night sky. In the cities, the people began lighting their towers through the long twilight, afraid that the darkness might never lift. The waves rose higher, the rains fell longer. The once quiet earth groaned beneath them as though struggling to remember the shape it once had. Crops failed, animals vanished, and even the tides refused to obey their moon. The cycle had entered its breaking point, but the songs of warning had become lullabies no one believed. In the final council, the keepers of Atlantis stood before their living crystals. the archives that pulsed with knowledge older than speech. The crystals flickered erratically, as if something was interfering with their memory. The air inside the hall grew thick, and the floor began to tremble beneath their bare feet. Then, for the first time in their recorded history, the crystals went dark. A great silence fell over the city, deeper than fear, heavier than grief. They realized then that the energy of the earth had reversed its flow. The breath of the world was exhaling. The age of light was ending. On distant shores, the fishermen of the Western Islands watched as the stars seemed to slide across the sky. At first they thought it an illusion of water and wind, but as nights passed, they saw that the North Star itself had moved. The heavens had become unanchored. Comets streaked across the blackness like silver tears. The ocean began to glow faintly, as though lit from beneath by unseen fires. And deep below the waves, something stirred, something vast, ancient and slow. The sea was awakening, and it was hungry. The temples of Lemuria shook as the first tremors reached their foundations. Bells rang without hands, walls vibrated with an invisible tone that no musician could reproduce. The priests knew then that the alignment was complete. Earth, fire, air, and water had converged in the same rhythm once more. It was the music of ending, the last chord of the first world. Still, they sang. They sang to calm the trembling of the land, to ease the sorrow of the coming flood. But their songs were drowned by thunder. The red wanderer flared one final time across the sky, then vanished into silence. The stars dimmed, the sea inhaled, the world waited. And somewhere, beyond the horizon of time, the first drop of rain began to fall. The world was quiet again, but not the same. The seas stretched across lands that once bloomed with temples and laughter. The air, heavy with salt, carried the faint scent of what had been lost: burnt stone, wet ash, memory. The survivors emerged from mountain caverns and high plateaus, blinking against a pale and uncertain dawn. The sky had changed color. Its blue was thinner, colder, as if it too had mourned through the long storm. They gazed across endless water, knowing the cities they once called home now slept beneath those rippling graves. Silence followed them wherever they walked, a silence too vast for words. Days became weeks, and the survivors began to move. They carried what little they had: crystals, seeds, fragments of song. Some followed birds across strange coastlines, others drifted upon makeshift rafts toward lands they had only seen in dreams. The flood had redrawn the earth itself. Where continents once touched, now lay seas. Where deserts had slept, new rivers coiled. The world had shifted upon its own spine, its pulse altered. Stars had rearranged their patterns. The constellations of the first world were gone, replaced by new symbols in the dark. Humanity was small again, fragile as the first fire. The cold came quickly. The heat of destruction gave way to endless frost. Great sheets of ice spread from the poles, swallowing valleys and plains. The survivors huddled in caves, wrapped in the hides of animals that wandered down from the white north. They built fires from the wreckage of their ships, their flames reflected in eyes that had seen too much. The elders whispered that the earth was healing, that after fire ice must come to soothe the wound. And so the glaciers advanced, slow and unstoppable, sealing the scars of the drowned world beneath crystal and silence. In the nights of that frozen dawn, strange lights danced across the sky. The survivors watched them flicker, green, violet, gold, believing them to be spirits of the lost. The aurora sang faintly, a sound like breathing through water. Sometimes they claimed to hear voices in the wind, soft, melodic, as though the drowned were still speaking through the frozen air. The elders said it was the memory of the flood, echoing through the magnet of the heavens. Others believed it was the gods themselves, weaving a new sky over the wounded earth. In either case, the world above had become as mysterious as the depths below. Life was harsh but sacred. Each sunrise was treated as a gift, each meal as ritual. The people learned again what their ancestors had forgotten: to live with less, to listen more deeply. They found warmth in community and meaning in survival. The children born after the flood grew up without memory of towers or songs, but they carried the instinct of reverence. They carved shapes into bone and stone, not as art, but as reminders. Spirals for the turning sky, waves for what once was, circles for what would come again. The wisdom of loss became their inheritance. And beneath the ice, the earth still moved. Mountains rose beneath glaciers, volcanoes smoldered under frozen seas, fire slept but never died. In certain places, the survivors found warmth rising from cracks in the ground, breath from the planet's hidden heart. They built their camps around these fissures, worshipping the heat as divine mercy. The elders warned that it was the same fire that had once ended them, now returning to keep them alive. The gods do not choose, they said, they only breathe. In those words, the new age of faith began. Not the worship of sky or ocean, but the worship of balance. Seasons blurred into one another. The sun climbed low, pale and slow, circling the horizon like a tired guardian. The ice thickened, the oceans calmed, the world entered a long sleep. Beneath its frozen surface, memories crystallized, entire cities entombed in blue silence. Statues stared upward through miles of ancient ice, their faces eroded yet still divine. The survivors who wandered north spoke of lights that shimmered beneath the glaciers, of faint warmth in the coldest caves. They said it was the heartbeat of the first world, still pulsing, still waiting. The fire had not left, it had only hidden beneath the ice. And so a new chapter of humanity began, not with conquest or pride, but with remembrance. The flood had stripped away knowledge but left behind wisdom. The people no longer sought to rule the elements, they sought to understand them. The wind became their teacher, the mountain their temple, the fire their silent god. In their exile, they rediscovered the holiness of being small. And though they had forgotten the language of the stars, they still felt watched by them, ancient lights observing from above, patient and sorrowful. For the universe remembers what mankind forgets. In the centuries that followed, the world settled into its long frost. Glaciers sprawled across the wounded continents like slow, shining beasts. The seas, once wild and vengeful, grew still and glassy, reflecting pale light from a sun that no longer burned with the same warmth. Beneath the frozen miles, the ruins of the drowned cities lay preserved. Temples turned to crystal, streets sealed in blue silence. Sometimes, when the wind was right, the ice would groan, deep and resonant, as though echoing the breath of those who once lived below. The people called it the voice of the earth. To them it was not mere sound, it was remembrance. The survivors who lived nearest the glaciers began to notice strange things. At night, when the frost grew thickest, faint lights would flicker beneath the ice, weaving patterns that mimicked constellations no one recognized. Children claimed to see shadows moving under the frozen ground, slow, luminous forms like memories trapped between worlds. The elders forbade digging near those places. The earth is dreaming, they said. Do not wake it too soon. But curiosity was stronger than fear. A few ventured out in silence, chiseling at the edges of the glaciers until their hands bled. And there, beneath layers of ancient frost, they found fragments of another time. The first discovery was a sphere of stone, smooth as water, humming faintly when touched. It did not break, it did not freeze. The survivors placed it near their fires, and the air around it shimmered with warmth, though no flame touched it. The old ones whispered that it was a relic of the first world, a seed of light buried to endure the flood. More relics followed, tablets etched in spirals, shards of mirror-bright metal, bones unlike any creature that walked the new earth. Each artifact carried a song, inaudible but felt, a low vibration that lingered in the chest long after it was gone. The ice had begun to speak. Those who listened grew changed. Their dreams lengthened. Their hearts pulsed to strange rhythms. Some woke at night murmuring words in languages no one had taught them. The elders began keeping watch, recording the dreams as sacred messages. They realized that memory itself was alive, that the world did not lose its knowledge, only buried it. The flood had not destroyed history. It had hidden it beneath cold mercy, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to listen. And so the survivors became students of silence. They built stone circles and icy shrines, marking the places where the earth whispered loudest. The most gifted among them were known as the listeners. They could feel the pulse of the frozen rivers, sense the shifting of buried fires beneath the snow. When they placed their palms on the ice, visions came, brief, radiant glimpses of towers glowing in warm light, of skies filled with stars that no longer existed. The listeners wept often, though they could not say why. "It is not sorrow," they said softly. "It is recognition." Through them, the memories of the first world lived again, not in words but in sensations. The past was not dead. It was breathing, slowly, beneath their feet. In time, the listeners began to map the places where the ice spoke most clearly. They marked lines across continents, tracing the same invisible veins that the ancient keepers had once known. These were the ley paths, the arteries of the planet's hidden fire. The survivors built small sanctuaries along these routes, where they could meditate and sing to the earth, awakening fragments of its buried warmth. And wherever they sang, frost would melt in delicate circles, revealing soil rich as black honey. They planted seeds there, and from the thawed ground the first green shoots of the new world emerged. Life, once drowned, had found its rhythm again. But with the thaw came warning. The fire beneath the ice began to stir. Volcanoes whispered beneath the seas, sending plumes of steam through cracks in the glaciers. The air grew thick with mist and mineral scent. The elders gathered once more, remembering what had happened before, the arrogance of those who played with the world's heartbeat. "The flood washed away pride," one said. "Let the fire not burn it back." Still, curiosity endured. Some among them believed the relics could awaken the old powers, restore the forgotten light. They built altars around the humming stones and chanted to the deep. The mountains answered with distant thunder. The ice continued to groan through the centuries. Sometimes it sighed, sometimes it roared like a hidden sea. The people learned to live in its rhythm, measuring seasons by its breath. They spoke of the glaciers as living gods, slow, immense, unknowable, and though they feared its hunger, they also loved its stillness. The ice was both tomb and teacher, erasing yet preserving, destroying yet remembering. In its silence, humanity learned patience again. And when the auroras flickered above the horizon, the people bowed their heads, for they knew the lights were messages from the buried age, shimmering in colors only memory could understand. And so, the frozen world endured, a world of quiet, reflection, and fragile warmth. Beneath miles of ice, the first world slept, its secrets intact, its fires waiting. The survivors, small and mortal, walked upon its frozen surface like shadows across a mirror. They carried in their hearts the faint echo of the flood's song, knowing that the earth was never finished, only dreaming. The ice would one day melt, the fire would rise again, and when it did, they hoped to be wiser, gentler than the ones who came before. When the ice began to soften, it did not melt, it sighed. The frozen breath of centuries released in clouds of silver mist, curling over the sleeping world like incense from an ancient altar. Beneath it, green returned, cautious and trembling. The first moss, the first shoots, the first hesitant color after endless white. Humanity, scattered and weary, followed the melt as one follows music. They descended from the high places, guided by rivers that remembered their old paths. Each valley they entered was both new and old at once, virgin soil covering forgotten bones. The earth had begun to breathe again, and mankind inhaled with it. The warmth came not as comfort, but as revelation. From the cracks in the thawing ground rose vapors that shimmered faintly in moonlight. When touched, they tingled against the skin like distant memory. The elders said it was the soul of the planet rising, the same fire that had once burned beneath Atlantis and Lemuria. They taught their children to gather near these steaming vents and listen. If one sat in silence long enough, they claimed to hear voices, not words but tones, the same ancient harmony that once shaped temples and stars. The people began to call these places the wells of memory, and around them, the first post-flood sanctuaries were built. The dreamers of the fire were born among those sanctuaries. They were the children of survivors who had inherited not cities, but longing. Each night they stared into the flames, trying to recall what their ancestors had forgotten. The fire became their teacher. It spoke in shapes, in flickers, in the dance of shadow against stone. Some saw visions of spiraling towers, of glowing stones, of oceans that shimmered with impossible light. They drew these images upon cave walls, upon bones, upon the wet earth itself. Thus began the first art of the second world, memory made visible. Through painting, through rhythm, humanity relearned the language of its own soul. As the ice retreated, rivers carried minerals and warmth from the mountains to the plains. Where water flowed, life followed. The dreamers settled along these rivers, building dwellings from mud, reeds, and the bones of ancient beasts. They learned to shape clay, to bake it in fire, to create vessels that could hold water and meaning. Each vessel bore a spiral, a symbol of the eternal turning, the cycle of flood and rebirth. Fire was no longer a danger, but a companion. They tended it with reverence, feeding it with fragrant wood, singing to it softly as if soothing a child. Fire became the bridge between the frozen and the living, the visible and the unseen. At night, under skies cleansed by centuries of silence, the dreamers watched the stars return. New constellations emerged, some familiar, others foreign. The elders gathered around fires and gave the stars names once more. They told their children stories of the world that had drowned, of the towers that hummed, of the priests who spoke to the earth. The young listened in awe, their imaginations painting worlds they would never see. Yet through those stories, memory endured. The myths became seeds planted in the soil of time, destined to bloom into future faiths. Every god that mankind would later name was born that night, in whispers beside the rekindled flame. Generations passed, and the dreamers became builders. They raised stone markers near the wells of memory, aligning them with the stars. When sunlight passed through the stones at dawn, they glowed faintly, an echo of the lost technology that once bound man to cosmos. None understood why it worked, but all felt the peace it brought. The earth seemed to listen when they sang. The wind seemed to soften when they prayed. Knowledge had faded, but reverence remained. The world no longer needed to be explained. It needed to be honored. This was the new law of the Second Age, to remember without understanding, to love without possession. Still, some hearts burned brighter than others. Among the dreamers were those who could not rest in the rhythm of simplicity. They sought the full fire, the deeper secret. They built their homes closer to the mountains, where the ground was warm and the air tasted of ash. There they experimented with the glowing stones and crystals recovered from the melting ice. They found that when placed together in circles, these relics emitted faint light, pulsing to the rhythm of the heartbeat. "The world still speaks," they said. "We have only forgotten how to answer." The elders feared them, but could not silence them. The hunger for knowledge had returned. The dreamers who followed the fire became the first smiths. They learned to melt ore, to shape tools and ornaments, to pull light from stone. Sparks leapt like tiny stars from their forges, each one a memory reborn. With every hammer strike, they felt the pulse of creation, the echo of a civilization that once sang its buildings into being. Some whispered that the fire itself remembered Atlantis, that in its heat lived the intelligence of the old world. They were not wrong. For each flame, each ember, was a fragment of the same cosmic breath that had shaped the dawn of time. Through their craft, humanity reawakened its own divine curiosity. But wisdom is fragile when born from ruin. The dreamers began to argue over the meaning of the fire. Some saw it as teacher, others as weapon. The warmth that had saved them began to divide them. Villages once united by song now guarded their flames jealously. The old lessons of humility faded like smoke in wind. "The fire is ours," some declared. "We command it." And thus began the slow return of forgetting, the old hunger for control, wrapped in the illusion of enlightenment. The ice had receded, but the memory of balance had not fully thawed. And yet, amid pride and passion, there remained those who remembered the silence, the few who still knelt before the fire, not to own it, but to listen. They became the new keepers, guardians of peace between flame and frost. Their voices were soft, their temples simple. They walked the lands teaching one truth, that all warmth carries its opposite within. Fire births life, and one day it consumes it. "Remember the flood," they whispered. It was not the sea that killed the world, it was the forgetting. Their words carried across the plains like wind through embers, faint but enduring, preparing humankind for the next turning of the earth. As centuries folded into centuries, the warmth returned to the world like a shy visitor. The glaciers withdrew into the north, leaving behind plains rich and dark, as if the sea had kissed the earth farewell. Forests spread again, rivers braided through valleys where once there was ice. The people, descendants of the dreamers, walked barefoot across soil still warm with memory. They built new villages around the sacred wells, the vents where Earth's breath still rose in soft, steaming sighs. They called these places the hearts of the world. Each morning, before the sun climbed the mountains, they would gather to watch the mist curl upward, fire reborn as vapor, ascending toward sky. In this gentler age, the children were born with strange eyes, pale, luminous, reflecting fire even in moonlight. The elders said these were the ones who had listened before birth, who had heard the echo of the flood in the womb of time. They grew to become visionaries, their dreams vivid, threaded with stars and songs. At night, they would speak of what they saw: rivers that glowed like veins of light, skies torn open by fire, towers rising again and falling once more. Their voices trembled not with fear, but with knowledge. "The earth remembers," they said softly, "and memory always returns." From these dreamers arose the first prophets. They traveled between tribes guided by instinct and the rhythm of the stars. They carried with them small stones that glowed faintly when the northern lights shimmered above. The people followed them in silence, for their presence calmed storms and their songs soothed animals. When they spoke, it was said the wind stopped to listen. They did not predict fortunes or kings. They spoke of cycles, of ages that rise like tides and fall as surely as waves. "Every world," they whispered, "is born from forgetting and dies from pride." Their words seeded both wonder and unease. The prophets built altars of both ice and flame, simple circles where frozen water met the breath of fire. These became symbols of unity, reminders that opposites sustain the world. Ice preserves, fire awakens. The balance between them is life itself. They taught the people to honor both heat and cold, to live between extremes. Their rites were wordless, meditations performed before sunrise when mist hung low and time seemed to hesitate. They would light small fires, then extinguish them with handfuls of snow, reminding all that even the brightest flame must one day rest. The people watched, entranced, half asleep within the rhythm of the ritual. But the world, though calmer, was never still. Beneath the surface, the earth continued its slow turning. The prophets sensed it first, a faint tremor underfoot, a subtle change in the pattern of seasons. The winds from the north began to taste of salt again. The auroras grew brighter, more restless, as though stirred by something unseen. The stars, once steady, now wandered slightly, their positions uncertain. The oldest prophet, whose hair was white as frost, watched the heavens each night in silence. One morning he traced a line in the ash and said, "The fire beneath the ice is stirring again. The world breathes in its sleep." In their visions, they saw what others could not. Great mountains cracking open, seas shifting, rivers reversing their flow. They spoke of returning floods, not punishment but renewal. Few believed them. The people had grown comfortable in the warmth, lulled by centuries of peace. They laughed gently at the warnings, calling them dreams of old minds. Yet some listened. These few began to carve symbols into stone once more, marking the alignments of stars, the passage of the sun, the tilt of the moon. They built observatories not as towers of power, but as instruments of remembrance, to record the sky's slow whisper before it shouted again. And so the prophets wandered until their voices became legend. Some vanished into mountains, others walked into the sea. Yet their words lingered, echoing in the chants of generations. They became myths, then gods, then forgotten again. But in hidden caves and deep sanctuaries, their teachings endured, etched upon walls in circles and flames, carved into bones and crystals. "Fire will always return," the inscriptions read, "and when it does, so shall we." Those who discovered the carvings did not understand their meaning, but felt peace when they touched the stone, as though an ancient promise pulsed within their fingertips. At last, the final prophet stood alone on a ridge of black rock, overlooking a valley veiled in mist. The sky above shimmered with faint green light, the northern aurora reaching farther south than ever before. He closed his eyes and listened. Beneath the ground he heard it again, the heartbeat of the buried world, deep and patient. He smiled, not in fear, but in recognition. "It has begun again," he whispered. "The fire remembers." Then, turning to the horizon, he raised his hands to the cold wind. Between his fingers, sparks flickered, tiny embers carried from the first dawn. The cycle had not ended. It had only begun to dream anew. And so the second world entered its long watch, its fragile peace stretched across time like frost over embers. Humanity would grow, forget, and rediscover itself again and again. The flood was never singular, only symbolic, a rhythm of endings and beginnings written into the breath of the planet. Beneath every civilization's foundation, the same pulse endures, the fire beneath the ice waiting for its moment to rise. Those who remember it do not fear its return. They understand that destruction is merely the world remembering its song. The prophets had called it destiny. We might call it time. The silence before the fall was unlike any other. The air grew heavy, the birds vanished, and even the rivers seemed to hold their breath. Across the frozen plains and thawing forests, the sky shimmered faintly, as though veiled by glass. The elders of the second world looked upward and saw a glow that did not belong to the sun or moon. It was red at first, gentle, almost beautiful, then deepened to gold, then white until the heavens themselves burned. The earth trembled softly beneath their feet. In that moment, the stars seemed to lean closer, as if watching what was about to unfold. The first light appeared over the northern horizon, brighter than any dawn. It did not rise, it fell. A streak of fire tore across the heavens, splitting the night into two halves. The forests lit up as though noon had returned, casting long, trembling shadows. The wind that followed was soundless yet immense, bending trees and lifting dust into spirals of fire. From every mountain and sea, eyes turned toward the sky, where 1,000 fragments of light now rained down like molten rain. The world glowed from above, and for the first time since the flood, the people felt the pulse of fear return to the earth. The prophets had spoken of this, the fire beneath the ice, the heavens remembering their power. Now their warnings became form. The Red Wanderer, long forgotten, had returned from the cold. Its trail spread across the stars, wide and endless, a scar of burning dust that refused to fade. In the highlands, the keepers watched as the comet's light illuminated the peaks, turning snow to mirrors. The glaciers cracked like thunder, releasing plumes of steam that glowed in the crimson sky. It was as if heaven and earth had begun to breathe together, one inhaling fire, the other exhaling smoke. Across the continents, animals grew restless. Herds stampeded toward the sea. Birds flew in circles until they dropped from exhaustion. The rivers began to swell, though no rain had yet fallen. The air smelled of metal and ash. When night finally came, it did not bring darkness. The sky blazed with dust and embers, a ceiling of red light that pulsed like a living thing. Children wept. Their mothers sang softly to drown the sound of the earth groaning. Beneath the frozen soil, the old fires stirred again, pressing upward, seeking air after centuries of sleep. The planet was remembering its own buried heartbeat. Then came the impact, a flash brighter than all the suns of memory, followed by a silence that broke sound itself. The ground convulsed, mountains bent, forests folded into flame. The seas rose and crashed upon themselves as if trying to escape the sky. The shock raced across the world faster than breath, toppling towers of ice, shattering plains of stone. Even the clouds seemed to scream. The sky turned black, then red, then vanished behind a veil of smoke so thick it devoured the stars. The heavens had fallen, and the age of fire had begun. In the aftermath, a darkness deeper than night covered the world. Ash rained for days, for months, for years. The sun became a memory. Its light filtered through a haze of drifting sorrow. The people wandered beneath this shadowed sky, their torches the only stars left on earth. The seasons lost their order. Snow fell in summer, lightning burned across frozen seas. Crops failed, animals fled, and hunger became the new prayer. The fire that fell from heaven had not ended with impact. It lingered invisible in the air they breathed and the dreams they carried. But amid the ruin, something strange occurred. The survivors began to see colors in the darkness, blue flames that danced without heat, faint halos around their hands when they touched one another. Some said it was madness, others, divinity. The elders believed it was the memory of light itself, trapped in the dust. They gathered what remained of their people and spoke of the prophecy once more. When the sky falls, the earth remembers. When fire rains, the seed awakens. And beneath their trembling feet, the soil, though blackened, began to stir with the promise of new growth. The stars were gone, yet the heavens were not silent. From beyond the smoke, faint vibrations returned, the hum of the universe rebalancing itself. The comet had vanished into the abyss, but its passage had left a mark upon time. The world would heal, though not as it was before. The prophets had said the flood cleansed, the fire renewed. Together they formed the rhythm of existence, the inhale and exhale of creation. And so beneath skies bruised by fire, humanity waited once again, humbled before the vast breath of the cosmos, small but awake. And when the first sunrise pierced through the ash, faint and fragile, the people wept. The light was weaker, the warmth uncertain, but it was enough. The world had survived its second death. Smoke drifted across valleys where glaciers once stood, curling through ruins that still steamed with memory. From that dawn onward, every flame lit by human hands carried a trace of that celestial fire, a memory of the day the sky fell and the earth remembered it was alive. The sun had vanished behind a veil of smoke. Its warmth, once steady as heartbeat, faded to a dim, distant glow. For years that could not be counted, the world lived beneath a ceiling of darkness. The air was heavy, tasting of stone and burnt salt. The seas no longer shimmered. They slept like molten glass, still and cold. The people called this age the long dusk. The sky never brightened, yet never fell completely into night. It hovered between states, half dead, half dreaming. Beneath that dim veil, humanity moved carefully, speaking softly, as though afraid to wake what slept above. Ash fell like snow. It gathered on rooftops, on mountains, on the bones of trees that once bloomed. The ground, layered in grey dust, muffled every step, so the world moved in silence. Even rivers flowed more slowly, their surfaces filmed with soot. Yet, beneath this morning, the earth still breathed. Steam rose from fissures in the ground, carrying warmth to the surface. The survivors built shelters near these veins of life, feeding small fires to keep the cold away. Each flame was sacred, a memory of the fallen heavens, a promise that light could still exist in a darkened world. Food was scarce. The animals of the plains vanished, the fruits turned bitter, and the soil, choked by ash, refused to yield. The people learned to live with less. They ate roots that tasted of smoke, drank melted frost, and sang to the seeds before burying them. They believed that song could soften the soil, that the earth needed to be reminded of kindness. The elders told stories to keep despair from devouring their hearts, tales of the first world when stars walked like gods and oceans glowed like mirrors. The children, who had never seen a clear sky, listened as if hearing a myth too distant to be true. In time, the smoke began to thin. The wind, once still, found its courage again and carried the ash eastward, scattering it across forgotten seas. Through the grey clouds, the faintest shimmer of light appeared, a pale sun, weak but alive. The people emerged from their shelters, blinking into the dim radiance. They saw their reflection in puddles of ash-filled rain, hollow faces, eyes like embers, skin streaked with soot. Yet when they saw the light, however faint, they smiled. They fell to their knees and pressed their hands to the earth, whispering gratitude not for what was given, but for what had endured. The elders gathered then, drawing circles in the dust. They taught that the fire had not destroyed the world, it had purified it. The sky had fallen to remind mankind of humility, to burn away the illusion of mastery. "We are not the builders," they said, "we are the breath." Their words spread quietly through the scattered tribes, shaping a new faith born not from temples, but from memory. This was the birth of the Fire Creed, the belief that light is never owned, only borrowed, and that every dawn must be repaid with reverence. The fire became their teacher once more, both beautiful and feared. The years that followed were years of slow renewal. The first rains returned, soft and uneven. They washed the ash from the mountains, carving dark veins through the plains. New rivers were born, their waters shimmering faintly from minerals carried by the flood of fire. Plants grew again, small, fragile things with silver leaves that glowed under the dim sun. The people tended them like children, speaking to them as they once spoke to gods. They believed that each sprout carried within it a fragment of forgiveness, that every root was an apology from the earth to its wandering children. In the far north, where the light was weakest, strange pillars began to rise from the ground. Not built by hand, not carved by tool, but formed by the earth itself. Columns of crystal, tall as trees, humming softly when touched. The people feared them at first, thinking them remnants of the fallen sky. But the prophets called them the earth's memory, solidified from the tears of the world. When wind passed through their hollow cores, they sang, low, resonant tones that echoed for miles. The survivors gathered to listen, believing the sound to be the earth's own prayer. Some claimed to hear words in the vibration, "Remember me." And so the world learned to live within its twilight. Days were dim, nights endless, yet both held a strange peace. Without bright light, shadows softened. Without abundance, greed faded. People spoke less, listened more. The great silence that followed the fire became a new teacher, gentler than flame, sterner than ice. They understood at last that the world does not end in anger, it ends in forgetting. The ashes beneath their feet were not graves, but pages of an ancient script waiting to be rewritten. Every footstep, every breath, became an act of creation. When finally, after many generations, the sky cleared fully, the stars returned, fewer than before, but sharper, prouder. The people wept again, for they recognized none of them. The heavens had changed their map, but though the constellations were different, they still spoke the same truth, that light can fall and still rise again. The world had passed through its shadow and survived. In the dust of that survival, new faiths were born, new myths began, and the old story of fire and flood continued, unbroken, eternal, whispering through the breath of humankind. When the smoke finally lifted, the heavens revealed themselves as strangers. The sky that returned was not the same sky that had fallen. Its stars had shifted, their positions rewritten, as if the universe itself had been turned and rearranged. The old constellations were gone. The familiar shapes had dissolved into chaos. But from that chaos, new patterns began to appear. The survivors gathered around their fires and looked upward in awe. They named what they saw not as gods, but as memories, burning embers of the flood's long song. The heavens had forgotten their old order, but in their forgetting, they had become beautiful again. Children born beneath this new sky knew nothing of the world before. They learned to measure time by the movement of the stars that replaced the old. Elders told them that each light was a soul returned from the flood, a fragment of those who had perished now shining eternally above. The children listened in silence, watching the slow rotation of the night, tracing their fingers across the black velvet of the heavens. In their innocence, the cosmos seemed whole again. What was lost became legend, and legend became faith. Humanity began once more to belong to the sky. The prophets, now aged and weary, taught that the heavens were mirrors of the soul. When man falls into arrogance, the stars turn away. When man remembers humility, they return. They gathered disciples under the open firmament and taught them to breathe with the rhythm of the stars, to exhale as the constellations descended, to inhale as they rose. Through these practices, the people believed they could commune with the universe itself. Each breath was a prayer, each heartbeat a note in the music of the spheres. The fire that had once destroyed them was now carried within, quiet, steady, divine. New settlements began to rise along the rivers reborn from melted glaciers. The air smelled clean again, tinged with ash and growth. The people built with patience, stacking stone upon stone in circles, aligning doorways with the rising sun. The first temples were not monuments of power, but observatories of peace, structures through which morning light could enter and pass untouched. Within these walls, they sang softly at dawn, blending voice with wind and bird call. Their architecture imitated memory, curving like the spiral of a shell, echoing the geometry of galaxies. It was as though the earth and the heavens had reconciled, each teaching the other how to heal. One night, beneath the silver moon, the youngest among them saw something new, a faint streak across the sky, delicate as breath. It glowed for only a moment before vanishing, leaving behind a trail of light like falling dust. The people watched in silence, remembering the fire that once fell but feeling no fear. This time they smiled. "The sky weeps for us," one whispered, "but its tears are gentle now." They began to call these brief lights sky seeds, believing that each falling star planted wisdom in the soil below. From that belief grew rituals of gratitude, offerings of flame, water, and song to honor the balance of creation and destruction. The elders began charting the new constellations upon slabs of stone. They carved them into spirals, circles, and lines that mirrored both the heavens and the rivers of the earth. These carvings became maps of both time and soul, a way to remember where they stood in the great turning. Each generation added new stars to the pattern, connecting them into stories. Over time, myth was born, tales of gods who swam through darkness, of fires that taught mercy, of waters that forgave. Myth became memory made gentle, the echo of survival translated into light. In the act of storytelling, the wound of the past began to close. Through these myths, the people began to understand the pattern of their own existence. The flood, the fire, the silence, all were chapters in the same vast cycle. They saw that destruction was not an end, but a renewal, that even loss was a form of creation. The sky itself was proof. From smoke came stars, from chaos came constellations. The universe was not cruel, it was patient. It erased only to rewrite, burned only to illuminate. The people finally understood that to live was to remember, and to remember was to forgive. The stars above became their teachers, the fire within their hearts, the lesson. As centuries passed, the new constellations gained names that endured. The Wanderer, the Serpent of Fire, the Sleeping Ocean. They became landmarks in both sky and soul. Navigators followed them across the seas. Poets wove them into dreams. The heavens that once destroyed the world now guided it. The people had learned to see differently, not with fear but with reverence. Every falling star was no longer omen, but promise. Every dawn was a reminder that the earth, no matter how often it burned or drowned, always found a way to remember its light. The smoke had become stars, and from those stars, humanity learned to dream again. And on quiet nights, when the world slept and the rivers stilled, those who listened closely could still hear the faint echo of the ancient fire, the hum that once united heaven and earth. It vibrated not in the air, but in the chest, like a heartbeat too vast to belong to one life. It was the sound of the cosmos remembering itself. And as the people breathed in time with it, they finally realized the truth whispered by every age before. The sky does not fall, it returns. The world had healed enough to breathe again. The rivers, once thick with ash, now shimmered with clear reflections of the newborn stars. The soil, dark and fragrant, welcomed the return of roots and song. Humanity, scattered but enduring, gathered in valleys where the earth still held warmth beneath the frost. They built homes of clay and stone, circular and open to the sky, as though afraid to forget its vastness again. Every dawn was a ceremony. The first rays of sunlight were greeted with bowed heads and whispered gratitude, thankful that the light had found its way back after so long a silence. The elders declared that a new covenant had been written between man and the elements. No longer would they seek to command the world, they would live as its voice. They taught their children to honor both fire and water, to remember that the same flood which destroys also gives birth. Temples were built not upon mountains of pride, but within valleys of humility, half above ground, half below, symbolizing the balance between heaven and earth. In these sanctuaries, the people sang the hymn of return, a slow wordless chant that imitated the rhythm of waves. The earth seemed to breathe with them, sighing in contentment through the wind. The hunters became farmers, and the wanderers became keepers. They learned to cultivate not only crops but memory. Stones were placed at the borders of fields, etched with spirals, and suns, reminders that life is circular, that endings always return as beginnings. The first written symbols appeared then, carved with care into wet clay. They were not words but songs, lines that represented wind, dots that represented rain, and curves that meant the pulse of the world. These early scripts were more prayer than record, each mark a conversation between the living and the land. Writing was born from the need to remember what silence could not hold. The night sky became their calendar. Each constellation marked a season, each rising star a ritual. Festivals were timed with the solstices and equinoxes, when the Earth's balance could be felt most clearly. During those nights, fires burned in circles across the plains, reflecting the stars above. The people danced slowly, their shadows weaving with the flames, until it was impossible to tell which light belonged to heaven and which to earth. These were not celebrations of power, but of gratitude, ceremonies to remind the world that they still remembered. And the sky, now kind, shone brighter each year, as if approving of their reverence. Generations passed and stories deepened. Myths became the bridges between memory and time. The tale of the flood transformed into allegory. The gods who wept for their children, the fire that fell as a teacher, not a weapon. Each retelling carried less fear and more wisdom. The flood was no longer a punishment, but a cycle, a necessary cleansing for the world's renewal. Through storytelling, humanity learned to translate loss into meaning. The stars were not reminders of destruction anymore. They became reminders of endurance. And in that transformation, mankind found its peace again. In the cradle of the new earth, the first cities began to rise. Small at first, clusters of stone dwellings beside rivers, places where trade, song, and prayer flowed together. But even as walls grew higher, the people remembered the old lesson: to build in harmony with wind and water, not against them. Each settlement was laid out according to the stars, each gate aligned with sunrise. They believed that to live aligned with the cosmos was to remain part of its eternal balance. The city was not a fortress. It was a reflection of the heavens turned gently upon the soil. Art returned. Clay figures of the old gods emerged from the earth, faces serene, eyes closed in eternal meditation. The people sculpted not to worship, but to remember. Music filled the new temples. Slow, resonant tones played on instruments made from bone, reed, and stone. The melodies imitated the rhythm of waves and wind, echoing the song of the flood long past. Every sound, every gesture, was a bridge between eras. The fire that once rained from heaven now danced harmlessly in their lamps, its light gentle and contained, no longer destroyer, but guide. Yet even as they flourished, a quiet truth lingered in their hearts. The prophets had spoken of cycles, that every age of balance would one day tilt again. The people did not fear this. They accepted it as law. They taught their children, do not try to stop the turning of the world, learn to move with it. It became the first philosophy of humankind, the understanding that peace is not the absence of change, but the grace to remain still within it. And thus, the age of rebirth was not an end, but a beginning wrapped in remembrance. At night, as fires dimmed and the world slipped towards sleep, the oldest among them would whisper to the stars, "We remember you." And when the wind answered, soft and low, they felt the warmth of that ancient breath, the same that once drowned them, burned them, and now kept them alive. The flood had passed, the fire had cooled, but the memory of both remained in the human heart. And so, under the patient gaze of new constellations, humanity dreamed on, unaware that every dream they dreamed was the earth remembering itself again. The world had grown quiet again. The great storms reduced to whispers on the horizon. Across the new continents, green returned, timid at first, then bold, then unending. Rivers wound like veins through fertile soil, mountains rose from the mist, and the air was sweet with the scent of wet earth. Humanity, scattered and reborn, learned once more to live in rhythm with the planet's breath. But even in peace, memory lingered. The elders could still feel the hum beneath the soil, the faint pulse that once shook mountains and drowned empires. It was not gone, only waiting. And so they built fires to remember. The flame was no longer wild. It no longer devoured forests or fell from the sky. It lived quietly now within stone bowls, protected from wind and pride alike. Each village kept one sacred fire, a descendant, they said, of the celestial blaze that once nearly ended them. The keepers were chosen to tend it. They were neither rulers nor priests, but listeners. Their task was not to control the fire, but to understand it. At dawn they whispered to it, at night they listened to its crackle. They believed the flame carried memory, that within its glow flickered the voices of the lost world. The first keepers built their sanctuaries far from cities, deep within forests and mountain caves. They called these places the Houses of Breath. The air inside was cool and fragrant with cedar. Fires burned softly in the center, their light reflecting on walls carved with spirals and waves. Each carving represented an element of the old balance: water, air, earth, and flame. The keepers believed that by meditating upon these symbols, they could hear the rhythm of creation itself. The fire's movement was studied like language. Its hiss and crackle were the syllables of a voice too vast to name, and through it they felt the pulse of the earth. The keepers kept no written records. They spoke in chants passed down through memory, each word shaped like breath, each pause filled with meaning. The chant began at dusk and ended at dawn, repeating the same vow: "We are not masters of fire, we are its mirror." Those who could recite it without faltering were said to have found alignment between body and flame. They became teachers of stillness, healers of imbalance. Villagers would travel for days to bring their sorrows to the keepers, who would sit in silence beside them until the fire itself seemed to answer. The flame healed not through speech, but through presence. Over time, the keepers grew into an order. Small, scattered, unseen, they traveled from settlement to settlement, carrying embers from one sacred fire to another. In clay vessels wrapped in linen, they transported the flame across mountains and seas, ensuring that light never vanished from the earth again. They called this journey the Long Vigil. To carry fire was considered the highest honor and the greatest burden. Those who did so were forbidden to speak until their mission was complete. It was said that the silence of these travelers kept the balance of the world intact. Each step, each breath was a prayer in motion. In the dark centuries that followed, kingdoms rose and fell, but the keepers endured. They appeared at the edges of history, advisors to kings, guardians of temples, wanderers cloaked in smoke. They asked for nothing, yet were welcomed everywhere. People said they could calm storms and quiet fever, that their eyes reflected flames even in darkness. But the keepers denied magic. "We are not chosen," they said, "we are remembering." For to them the flame was not a miracle. It was the memory of balance, the proof that creation and destruction were one and the same breath. To forget that truth was to invite another flood. As ages passed, the sacred fires became symbols of continuity. Each generation added new rituals around them: songs, dances, offerings of herbs and oil. Yet the keepers kept their ways simple. They refused grand temples, refused crowns and gold. "The flame is not ours," they would remind those who came seeking power. "It belongs to the silence that birthed it." Some rulers sought to capture the keepers, believing their fire divine, their knowledge eternal, but none succeeded. Those who tried found only ash, for the keepers never fought. They vanished like smoke into wind. Legends grew around them. Some said they could live for centuries, sustained by the warmth of their sacred fires. Others believed they were the reincarnations of the first survivors, the ones who had sung as the floodwaters rose. Their faces appeared in carvings across distant lands, always the same: calm eyes, open hands, a small flame cupped between their palms. In every depiction they were not worshipped, but remembered. To see a keeper was to glimpse the quiet mercy of the world, a reminder that even after chaos, stillness survives. And so the keepers guarded the light of memory. While empires forgot, they remembered. While wars raged, they tended their quiet fires. They did not write, they did not build. They preserved the rhythm of breath. In their silence, the wisdom of lost ages endured, carried through time not as knowledge but as presence. Beneath the same stars that once burned the earth, the keepers knelt each night and whispered the same prayer their ancestors had once sung to the flood. "May the fire never rise in anger again. May it only warm, only guide, only remember." The sanctuaries of the keepers were never built upon cities. They rose in places where the world itself seemed to breathe, on cliffs above the sea, within caves where wind sang through stone, beside rivers that glowed faintly under moonlight. These were not temples of wealth or worship. They were chambers of stillness shaped by time, not hands. When one entered, all noise ceased. The air felt alive, thick with a kind of invisible pulse. The keepers called it the breath of the earth. They said it was the voice of the world in its purest form, the same breath that once stirred oceans and carved mountains into memory. Inside each sanctuary, a single flame burned. It was never large, never bright, but steady. The keepers guarded it not as owners, but as caretakers of balance. Around it, the walls shimmered with carvings, spirals within spirals, circles within circles, a language of rhythm and silence. No one remembered when the carvings had begun, or who had first traced their lines. The keepers said they were older than the flood, older even than language itself. When wind passed through the chamber, it made the carvings hum softly, as though stone itself were sighing. Those who listened long enough could feel their heartbeat matching the tone. The air inside the houses of breath was filled with sound, not of words, but of vibration. The keepers used bowls of bronze and crystal, striking them gently to summon tones that rippled through the room. The resonance cleansed thought, washing away restlessness. Visitors described it as listening to the memory of oceans. Sometimes, they said, the flames responded, flickering higher, dancing in time with the tones. To the keepers, this was proof that matter and spirit were never separate. Fire was simply the visible form of sound, and sound the invisible shape of fire. Every tone was a bridge between seen and unseen. At the center of the chamber stood a shallow pool. It reflected both the flame and the stars above through an opening carved in the roof. The reflection shifted gently with the wind, a perfect union of water and light. The keepers meditated beside it for hours, their eyes half closed, their breath synchronized with the flicker of the flame. They believed that each exhale joined the great rhythm of the planet. That breath was the first and final prayer. To breathe consciously was to exist as the world existed, not in haste but in eternal return. The houses were their lungs and the world their body. When night deepened, the keepers began their ancient chant. It was not sung but breathed. Tones formed on the edge of silence. Each note lingered long enough to melt into the next, like ripples merging upon still water. The chant had no beginning, no end. It was said to mirror the song of creation itself, the vibration that first called matter into form. The words were forgotten long ago, but the rhythm remained. It passed from keeper to keeper, heart to heart, unbroken across ages. To hear it was to feel the flood, the fire, and the rebirth all at once. To sing it was to remember being alive before time began. The keepers stored their knowledge not in books, but in resonance. They carved grooves into crystal slabs, tuning them to hold specific tones. When struck, the slabs sang back the chants of those long gone. This was their library, a hall of living sound. The vibrations lingered in the air for days after a chant ended, echoing faintly through the stone corridors. Travelers claimed they could hear voices whispering from the walls, though none understood the words. The keepers smiled at such stories, saying, "The walls are not whispering to you, they are remembering themselves." In this way, the memory of the world remained alive, vibrating in silence. No keeper lived forever, yet none truly died. When one passed, their ashes were mixed with oil and burned within the sacred fire. It was said that their essence entered the flame, merging with its light, their voice becoming part of the eternal hum. The fire that burned in each sanctuary was therefore more than heat. It was a lineage, a continuity of breath stretching back to the dawn of the first world. Each flicker carried the memory of countless keepers, each spark a syllable of humanity's unbroken prayer. The living tended the flame, the dead became it. Outside the houses of breath, the world began to stir once more. Tribes grew into kingdoms, and kingdoms began to dream of power again. The noise of ambition echoed across the valleys, reaching even the most remote sanctuaries. The keepers felt it in the tremor of their flames, the flicker that came when harmony was disturbed. "The world is waking too fast," one of them whispered. "It is remembering its fire, but not its silence." Yet still, they tended their lights, refusing despair. For they knew that all things rise, fall, and rise again follow the same rhythm. The breath continues, even through forgetting. And so the houses of breath endured, hidden among stone and forest. Their flames burned quietly as empires began to murmur beyond the mountains. The keepers, few but steadfast, waited and listened. They had no fear of what was coming, for they understood the world's pattern too well. The flood, the fire, the silence, all were steps in the same eternal movement. As long as one flame still burned, balance could return. And in the stillness of their sanctuaries where breath met light, they whispered the vow of all their kind. When the world forgets again, we will remember. As centuries drifted like smoke, the keepers grew fewer, but their wisdom deepened. Their silence had become a kind of speech, their patience a form of knowing. They began to study not the fire itself, but the spaces between its flickers, the pauses where shadow met light. They believed that truth was hidden there in the rhythm between appearances. When flame moved, they said, it spoke. When it stilled, it listened. By learning to read these movements, they created the first silent language, the tongue of the world's oldest element. They called it Pyra, meaning that which breathes in two directions. The keepers discovered that every flame carried a pattern of pulse unique to its place and moment. No two fires ever burned alike, just as no two lives ever shared the same rhythm. By observing these pulses, they claimed they could foresee changes in the earth, the coming of storms, the trembling of mountains, the birth of wind. To them, prophecy was not divine but natural, a reading of the fire's heartbeat. When the flames burned blue, they said the heavens were at peace. When they hissed and leaned east, the sea was restless. The world's fate was written not in stars, but in embers. They began to mark their observations in circles of soot upon smooth stones. Each ring recorded a shift of the flame, a change in sound, in color, in dance. Over time, these markings became symbols, and the symbols became script. Thus was born the first alphabet of light. It was a language meant not for the eyes, but for memory. To read it, one had to feel its rhythm, not pronounce it. The keepers used it to record the wisdom of ages, the stories of the flood, the songs of fire, the laws of balance. Each word was a vibration, a bridge between silence and sound. Within the houses of breath, they began to teach this language in stillness. Novices would sit before the flame for days, learning to hear its tone before they saw its motion. The test of mastery was simple: to sit unmoving until one's heartbeat matched the rhythm of the fire. Some took years to achieve it. Those who succeeded claimed they could hear voices hidden within the heat, a chorus of those who had tended the flame before them. The keepers did not call this magic, they called it listening. For them, enlightenment was not an ascent, but a return to the pulse that all things share. As the language evolved, it reached beyond prophecy and meditation. The keepers found that certain patterns of sound could change the shape of fire itself. A single note, sung with perfect stillness, could cause the flame to split into two. Another could draw it higher, thin as a thread of gold. They learned to weave these tones together, creating sequences of resonance that echoed through stone and water alike. The world responded. Flames in distant sanctuaries would flicker in unison, as though joined by invisible breath. The keepers realized they had uncovered the first laws of correspondence, that what moved in one place could awaken another. They recorded these harmonies within crystal tablets, clear slabs that shimmered faintly when struck by sound. The vibrations passed through them like ripples on a pond, preserving the sequence as light. Each tablet became both song and scripture, holding within it a code of frequencies that could restore balance when chaos returned. The keepers stored them deep within their sanctuaries, beneath layers of stone safe from greed and time. They called them the mirrors of fire. Legends later mistook them for weapons, but they were songs, the music of equilibrium, designed to remind the earth of its own peace. Through this sacred language, the keepers began to communicate across distances. They built small towers at the edges of mountains, lighting fires in unison according to the rhythm of their chants. From peak to peak, the flames answered one another, flickering in coded patterns that only the initiated could read. Thus, knowledge traveled faster than feet, carried by light itself. To the unknowing, it was merely the dance of distant fire. To the keepers, it was communion, a network of living memory stretching across continents. They had woven the world together once more, not with power but with understanding. But even in purity, corruption waits. Kings began to hear whispers of the keepers' fire language, of their crystals that could speak without words. Some sought it for control, others feared it as heresy. Armies marched near the mountains demanding the secrets of the flame. The keepers refused, for the language could not be taught to those who did not know silence. To misuse it, they said, would awaken the sleeping wrath of the earth, the same force that once turned oceans against men. The fire remembers, they warned. It does not forgive pride twice. Their refusals sowed fear, and fear soon became myth. As empires rose and greed returned to the human heart, the keepers began to hide their knowledge. They buried their tablets beneath rivers, sealed their sanctuaries in stone, and extinguished some of their fires so that light would not fall into unworthy hands. The world above forgot them, as it forgets all things sacred. But beneath mountains and deserts, the flames still burned in secret, tended by those who never left their vigil. The language of flame continued in whispers, carried by wind, echoed by stars, an ancient dialogue between the world and itself. Even in silence, the earth still spoke, and so the keepers endured, half legend, half memory. They became the unseen roots of every later mystery, the oracles, the seers, the temple singers who remembered songs older than speech. Through them, fragments of the ancient fire language survived, disguised as prayer, as ritual, as myth. The world would one day forget their names, but not their influence. For wherever flame meets shadow, wherever silence hums with life, there echoes their first and final teaching. To listen is to live, to speak is to remember, to burn is to return. There came a time when even the mountains seemed to sigh, as though tired from holding so many secrets. The fires of the keepers still burned, but their light no longer reached the valleys. New kingdoms had risen, loud, bright, and hungry. The world's noise had returned. The old balance began to tilt once more, not by storm or flood, but by the slow erosion of silence. The keepers felt it in the tremor of their sacred flames, the faint irregularity of the world's heartbeat. They gathered in council beneath the stars and understood what must be done. Their era was ending, but their memory could not be allowed to die. Under the last full moon of that age, they performed a ritual of farewell. The houses of breath filled with the sound of crystal bowls and the low hum of 1,000 voices breathing as one. The flames in each sanctuary rose higher than ever before, stretching toward the roof, as if yearning to escape the bounds of stone. The keepers stood in a circle, faces calm, eyes reflecting fire. "The world is forgetting again," they whispered. "We must become its memory." When the final note of the chant faded, they divided the sacred embers among themselves, small vessels of living light to be carried into exile. They left their sanctuaries in silence. Some walked toward the deserts, others into forests, others still across the sea. Wherever they went, they carried fire wrapped in linen, hidden from sight yet burning within. The wind followed them like a companion, and in the distance the mountains wept smoke. It was said that the earth itself mourned their departure, for their presence had kept its pulse steady through the centuries. Now, the rhythm faltered. The keepers knew this was necessary. The fire must rest, they said. It must sleep inside the heart of men. And so began the silent exodus, the scattering of light into flesh. Each keeper became a seed of remembrance planted in a different corner of the world. In time, their descendants would carry echoes of their wisdom without knowing its source. Some became healers, some poets, some architects who built temples that sang when the wind passed through them. Others became wanderers, speaking in riddles that outlived their names. They no longer called themselves keepers, for the order no longer existed. But wherever warmth and quiet met, where a flame burned without fear, there the old spirit survived. The fire had moved inward, becoming the secret rhythm of the human soul. As centuries passed, the sanctuaries were reclaimed by the earth. Forests grew through the roofs, rivers swallowed their doors, mountains closed their mouths around them. The carvings faded, the crystals dulled, the chants fell silent. Travelers who stumbled upon these ruins called them the halls of the old ones, the temples of breath, or simply places where the air listens. Some claimed that at night, if you stood still within their shadows, you could hear faint humming like distant music beneath the ground. It was said the fire still burned there, small and eternal, waiting for the world to remember again. The keepers' knowledge dissolved into myth. Their fire language became fragments scattered among cultures, the chants of monks, the hymns of temples, the whispering tones of shamans. Even the word pyra endured, reshaped into countless tongues as Pyr, fire, Purus, Fuer. What had been a language of balance became merely a word, yet within that word still slept the ancient memory. The keepers had not failed. They had transformed. For wisdom cannot live forever in the open, it must die seed-like to bloom again when the earth is ready. In the ages that followed, new faiths arose, each claiming to hold the truth. None knew that their sacred fires, their altars, their rituals of flame and breath were children of the same forgotten lineage. The temples of Egypt, the shrines of the East, the firekeepers of forgotten tribes, all carried the same spark, unknowingly fulfilling the keeper's vow, that light would never vanish, only change its form. Humanity had inherited the ember without remembering the source. Yet somehow across time and language, the same instinct endured, to guard the flame, to pray beside it, to whisper into it, as though it could hear. Legends tell that once every 1,000 years, a lone wanderer appears, a figure who walks between ruins, lighting forgotten fires. He speaks little and his eyes reflect the color of dawn. When asked who he is, he only smiles and says, "I am what remembers." Then he vanishes again into mist. The people who meet him say that after his passing, their hearths burn steadier, their dreams clearer. Perhaps he is no man at all, but the last echo of the keepers, walking the earth to remind it of its promise. The fire travels on, from breath to breath, from dream to dream. And so the world turned. The memory of the keepers fading into legend, then into silence. The temples slept, the flames dimmed, yet beneath it all, the pulse endured. Every civilization that rose afterward carried their rhythm unknowingly, through art, through prayer, through the instinct to protect light. For even when forgotten, truth has its own gravity. The keepers were gone, but their vow remained written in the heart of every living thing. We do not own the fire, we are the fire. And through that truth, the earth itself kept breathing. When darkness no longer threatened, and the earth had steadied its breath, humanity looked upward once more. The night sky, vast and unblemished, stretched above them like a forgotten script. For generations they had lived beneath it without truly seeing. Now the stars seemed alive again. They gleamed with quiet familiarity, as though recognizing the faces turned toward them. The survivors' descendants gathered around fires at dusk, pointing at constellations that shimmered like scattered memories. They sensed meaning but could not name it. Something within them stirred, a feeling older than speech, a recognition carried through blood and dream. The heavens had begun to speak again. Each night, the stars changed their positions slightly, shifting in ways too precise to be chance. The elders watched them with devotion, mapping their journeys across bark and bone. Slowly, patterns emerged, spirals, arcs, and paths that mirrored the shapes carved long ago within the houses of breath. The keepers were gone, yet their rhythm had survived in the sky itself. The people began to understand that the stars were not random, but rhythmic. They moved with the same patience as the tides, the same pulse as the human heart. The heavens, they realized, were keeping time for the earth. The first astronomers were not scholars, but listeners. They lay upon cool stone and listened to the hum of the night, feeling the air tremble with invisible song. To them, the stars were not distant fires, but tones of light, each one vibrating in harmony with the planet below. When one star brightened, a river would rise. When another dimmed, the rains would pause. They kept records not with ink, but with rhythm, tapping sticks, murmuring chants that followed celestial movement. They understood that knowledge was not in numbers, but in memory, repetition, tone, silence. The universe spoke through pattern, and they learned to echo it. In the valleys where the earth was soft and the sky wide, they built the first circles of stone. Each pillar was placed in alignment with the stars rising, each shadow marking the turning of the year. These circles were not built to worship the sky, but to converse with it. When the wind moved through the stones, it sang softly, producing tones that matched the chants of the old keepers. The people called these places the listening rings. They believed the stones caught the breath of the stars, holding their music long after dawn. Even now, when wind brushes through such ruins, one can almost hear the sky's low, endless song. As the circles multiplied, The tribes began to travel between them, carrying stories of alignment and light. They spoke of the great star that burned red before the flood, of constellations that had vanished in the sky's turning. Each region remembered differently, yet all shared one truth, that the heavens had once fallen and would fall again. This knowledge did not bring fear, but reverence. They accepted the stars as both creation and warning, as witnesses to all that came before. To live beneath them was to live in the memory of time itself. The night was no longer emptiness, it was history, suspended in fire. The oldest among them told of a time when men could hear the music of the spheres, a harmony so vast that even silence vibrated with it. They said the stars were the souls of the drowned, singing forever, so the world would not forget. The younger ones listened in awe, their hearts filling with a strange longing. For them, to look at the stars was to feel both homesick and hopeful, as though remembering a place they had never been. The heavens were mirrors now, reflecting both the loss and the endurance of humankind. Every twinkle was a breath from the past, a spark of divine recollection. Over time, the study of the stars became a sacred craft. Those who practiced it were called the Watchers. They built observatories from stone and crystal, open to the elements, so that nothing stood between them and the cosmos. They observed in silence, speaking only when necessary, for they believed words could disturb the rhythm of the heavens. By night, they watched the stars move in endless procession. By day, they traced their paths upon sand and slate. Their task was not to predict, but to remember, to hold the shape of the sky steady in human thought, so that memory would not drift as easily as constellations. And when comets returned, small streaks of silver across the firmament, the Watchers did not tremble. They bowed their heads, whispering the words of the old creed, "All that falls will rise again." They knew the heavens had not cursed the earth, only reminded it. The flood, the fire, the silence, all had been messages written in light. The sky was not enemy, but teacher. It destroyed only to awaken, erased only to rewrite. The Watchers passed this truth to their apprentices, who carved it into stone near the sacred circles. As above, so below, as within, so without. The phrase would echo through civilizations long after its meaning was forgotten. At last, the Watchers lit fires atop their observatories, small flames mirrored by stars above. From mountain to desert, from forest to sea, the earth answered the sky in a language older than words. The light of man reflected the light of heaven, each feeding the other in quiet rhythm. And in that balance, for the first time since the flood, the world exhaled without fear. The stars had remembered mankind, and mankind in turn had remembered the stars. In the cool nights after the long frost, when the air was thin and sharp as crystal, the Watchers gathered upon the high plains. They carried no tools save their voices, for the sky required no instruments, only attention. Around them the world lay silent, vast and listening. They began to hum, low and steady, matching the pulse they felt beneath their feet, the same rhythm they saw mirrored in the movement of stars. The sound rose slowly, spreading through the night air, until it seemed that the heavens themselves were breathing with them. It was not a song of praise, but of recognition, the sound of two worlds remembering each other. As the Watchers sang, they discovered that certain tones made the stars shimmer more brightly. When they held a note long enough, light seemed to ripple across the constellations, as if sound could touch the sky. They realized that the heavens were not silent, as most believed, but vibrated with their own hidden song, a hum too deep for ordinary ears. They began to call this resonance the music of the spheres. Each planet, they said, had its own tone, each star its own chord. Together they formed a symphony of creation, repeating endlessly since the first dawn. To listen was to remember the blueprint of existence. They recorded what they heard, not with symbols but with fire. Small torches were placed in rings upon the ground, their flames flickering in time with the singer's breath. The Watchers discovered that by adjusting the rhythm of their chant, they could make the flames lean or rise as if dancing to the harmony of heaven. This was the birth of the fire choirs, ritual gatherings, where light and voice became one. The fire was the body, the song the spirit. Together they created patterns that mimicked the constellations above, transforming the earth itself into a mirror of the sky. These songs were not kept secret. The tribes who lived near the Watchers began to gather on the solstices, drawn by the haunting beauty of the sound. They would sit in silence, watching the stars shimmer above and the fires dance below, until distinction between the two vanished. The Watchers taught them simple chants, tones that calmed storms and called rain, notes that soothed fear and silenced war. People began to believe the Watchers could speak to the gods, though the Watchers themselves denied it. "We do not speak to the heavens," they said, "we sing with them." And the sky seemed to agree. In time, these harmonies became more than ritual, they became language. Notes replaced words, and meanings were carried in vibration rather than phrase. The Watchers believed that sound could shape thought, and thought could shape matter. They taught that a pure tone could cleanse the mind, could realign the soul with the pulse of the universe. Across continents, their melodies spread, carried by wind, imitated by flutes, drums, and hollow stones. And wherever their songs were sung, strange things happened. Seeds sprouted faster, water cleared itself of dust, and people dreamt of lights descending from the heavens to stand beside them, radiant and calm. The tribes called these radiant beings the voices of light. The Watchers called them memories, the personified echoes of the stars themselves. Some saw them in dreams, others in waking visions, tall, silent figures whose eyes held the glow of constellations. They were neither gods nor ghosts, but reflections, symbols of what humanity had once been when it still lived in harmony with the cosmos. The Watchers taught that these beings were not to be worshipped, but remembered. "They are the shape of our own perfection," they said, "the echo of what we lost when the sea rose and the sky fell." As generations passed, the Watchers' songs began to change. What had been pure tones of unity began to divide into scales, modes, and melodies. Complexity replaced silence, devotion replaced listening. The old harmonies splintered into prayers and chants, and from those chants grew the first religions. The people began to name the stars: Amun, Ishtar, Enlil, and Ra, forgetting that the names were once notes, not words. The heavens that had once been a choir became a court of gods. Yet even in their confusion, the truth survived. Every hymn, every sacred song carried within it a fragment of the original music, the vibration of balance. The Watchers foresaw this change and accepted it. They knew that every age must forget in order to remember anew. The stars, they said, will become gods, and the gods will become stories, and through those stories, the truth will live. Before the end of their age, they carved their teachings into stone circles and mountain faces, not in language but in geometry, spirals, triangles, and points aligned with the stars. Each symbol was a silent chord, a frozen vibration. They left no names behind, only rhythm, and when they vanished, their absence itself became a note in the song of the world. Long after they were gone, people continued to gather on high places to sing beneath the sky. Their melodies changed with time, their instruments grew, their myths expanded, but the intent remained the same. Even now, when choirs sing in cathedrals or monks chant before dawn, the vibration is the same one that once stirred the stars. The Watchers are gone, yet their music endures. In every prayer, in every breath, in every voice that dares to lift itself toward heaven. For as long as sound exists, the stars will remember. When the songs of the Watchers faded into myth, their echoes found form in stone. Humanity, guided by instinct and memory, began to raise structures that mirrored the sky. It began humbly, with stones aligned to sunrise, with shadows marking the longest day. But soon something deeper stirred. The builders realized that the heavens moved not only above but within them. To trace the stars was to trace the soul. They laid their hands upon the earth and felt its rhythm echo the turning of the constellations. The world, they understood, was not beneath the sky, it was part of it. In the high plains of the dawn world, they built circles that matched the dance of the heavens, each stone placed with patience, each gap aligned with the stars rising. They were not monuments to gods, but mirrors for memory, portals through which the sky could speak to the soil. The wind passing through those openings sang softly, carrying tones that matched the ancient chants of the Watchers. These songs never died. They merely changed language, turning from vibration to geometry, from sound to structure. The people no longer sang to the stars. They built them into the earth. In a land that would one day be called Anatolia, they raised great pillars carved with animals, the Watchers of the sky, lions for the sun, serpents for the rivers of stars, vultures for death and rebirth. Each figure faced a direction known only to those who read both heaven and horizon. The site glowed under starlight, alive with symmetry and silence. Millennia later, ruins would call it Göbekli Tepe, but to its makers, it was the navel of heaven, the place where the sky had once touched the earth before the flood. To stand within its circle was to feel suspended between two eternities, light above and memory below. Far to the south, where deserts breathed fire by day and shivered by night, the same dream took root. The tribes of the sands built stone calendars that measured the solstices, marking when the sun's path shifted. They called these stones the Eyes of Ra, though their true origin lay older than any name. Each shadow cast upon them was a note in the same celestial rhythm, the pulse that had once connected humanity to the cosmic breath. Across the dunes, the people began to speak of great travelers who had come from the stars, who taught them to remember the patterns of the heavens through the geometry of stone. In time, those patterns reached Egypt. There the builders looked not to the mountains but to the sky, aligning their monuments with the belt of Orion. They said the gods descended from those three stars, but the truth was simpler. They were continuing the work of remembrance. The pyramids rose not as tombs, but as instruments of balance, structures through which the earth could breathe with the cosmos once more. Inside their chambers, sound vibrated in perfect harmony with the stars they mirrored. Even now, when wind moves through their narrow corridors, it hums in the same key as the ancient songs of the Watchers. Beyond the seas, others followed the same call. In the highlands of the Andes, stones were shaped to echo constellations, their corners aligned with the points of sunrise. Across the oceans, islands marked by giant faces turned toward the horizon, where certain stars rose and set. None of these builders ever met, yet their designs spoke the same silent language, the geometry of remembrance. It was as if an invisible thread connected their minds, carrying fragments of the same forgotten wisdom. The stars had whispered, and humanity had listened, shaping continents into maps of the heavens. These structures became the first schools of time. Within them, generations learned to measure the seasons, the solstices, the eclipses, the return of the wanderers across the sky. The priests of these temples were not rulers, but interpreters of rhythm. They spoke of balance, of the repeating cycles that governed both nature and man. To lose harmony, they warned, is to forget the stars. And so the architecture of memory grew. Cities became calendars, temples became symphonies of stone, each echoing the cosmic breath that once set the flood in motion. But with understanding came pride, and pride always invites forgetting. Some among the builders began to see themselves not as listeners, but as masters. They sought to summon the heavens rather than reflect them. They built higher, sharper, hungrier. The old humility began to fade, and with it, the purity of alignment. The stars above shifted again, ever so slightly, as though reminding them that no pattern is permanent. Yet still they built, chasing the light rather than serving it. The map of heaven was nearly complete, but already the cracks of arrogance had begun to form. And so, beneath the still gaze of the constellations, the seeds of greatness and ruin were sown together. The stars, patient as time itself, watched as mankind tried once more to imitate their perfection. But the sky remembers what man forgets. That balance is not conquest but surrender. The temples stood as mirrors of heaven, yes, but mirrors also reflect vanity. The heavens had been brought to earth, yet in that triumph, the first whisper of imbalance returned. The story of the flood, though buried, was not finished. It waited, quiet as starlight, for its echo to return. At first, the change was too subtle to see. The stars still shone, the temples still stood, and the songs of the Watchers still echoed faintly in the rituals of priests. Yet something beneath the surface had begun to shift. The earth no longer hummed with the same gentle rhythm. Its pulse grew uneven, uncertain. Nights that once felt eternal now seemed hurried, restless. The wind carried whispers through the stone corridors of temples, as if the air itself was warning. Those who listened closely to the sky heard it first, the faint disharmony, like a single note fallen out of tune in an endless song. The builders had grown proud of their precision. They measured the heavens as if they owned them, charting every rising, every eclipse, every breath of the stars. They began to call themselves the architects of light, believing they had mastered the pattern. Their cities gleamed beneath the constellations, vast networks of stone aligned to the sky's memory. But their harmony was mechanical now, not sacred. The temples no longer vibrated with life, they merely reflected it. The stars, once their teachers, had become their trophies. And in that subtle arrogance, the first error was made, the smallest misalignment invisible to the eye but felt by the soul. The priests gathered to correct it. They studied the heavens for months, yet the stars no longer obeyed their markings. Constellations drifted from their expected places. The sun rose slightly off its path. The moon's pull grew strange upon the tides. In their panic, they rebuilt the markers, altering what had been perfect. But the more they adjusted, the more the balance slipped. "The heavens are wandering," one whispered. "Or perhaps we are." Yet none dared admit the deeper truth, that their hearts had wandered first. For it is not the stars that fall from grace, but those who cease to listen to them. In the nights that followed, strange lights appeared in the northern sky. Comets, some said. Omens, said others. Trails of fire cut through the constellations, leaving scars of silver smoke that lingered for weeks. The people grew fearful. Offerings were made, temples crowded with prayers. Yet the watcher's old warning returned in whispers. When the stars weep fire, the world begins to turn again. The priests dismissed it as superstition, but the winds grew wilder, the seasons unpredictable. Crops failed, rivers turned violent, and the calm that had lasted for centuries began to unravel. The stars above were speaking, but no one remembered how to listen. Among the faithful, there were still a few who watched in silence. They gathered on mountain ridges, away from the noise of the cities, and saw the same red glow rising again that their ancestors had once feared. It moved slowly across the heavens, bright as memory, cold as inevitability. They traced its path through time and found it returning to the same place the old records described, the mark of the wanderer, the star that had once preceded the flood. They felt the ground tremble softly beneath them, and a chill passed through their bones. "It remembers," one of them whispered. "The sky remembers." The great kings grew desperate. They demanded sacrifices, offerings of flame and gold, believing they could bribe the heavens back into favor. Towers were built higher than before, reaching greedily for the light. They burned forests for torches, set rivers aflame with oil, and filled the night with smoke. Their cities glowed like false suns beneath the stars. Yet for all their fire, the world only grew darker. The heavens shimmered faintly, as if turning their face away. The red wanderer swelled in brightness, and the people began to whisper that the gods had grown tired of man's noise. In the temples of alignment, the old songs were sung again, not in devotion, but in fear. The tones that once soothed the earth now sounded harsh, dissonant. The stones themselves seemed weary, their harmony broken. Echoes no longer returned pure. They came back distorted, as though the world had lost its resonance. The priests stood helpless before the statues of their gods, begging for signs. But the only answer came from the sky, a deep, shimmering silence before the storm. Those who remembered the stories of the first flood recognized that silence. It was not absence, it was warning. And so as the red wanderer brightened, the night sky once again became both mirror and prophecy. The stars that had guided the builders now watched them in sorrow. The same heavens that once saved mankind now prepared to remind it once more. The old rhythm was returning. The inhale before the great exhale, the gathering before the release. The earth had begun to stir, its pulse syncing again with the cosmic beat of renewal. For in every age, when pride outweighs reverence, the heavens fall not in anger but in correction, and somewhere beyond the clouds the stars began to move. When the heavens settled and the red wanderer vanished beyond the horizon of time, The earth exhaled once more. The storms quieted, the rivers found their paths again, and a fragile dawn spread across the broken world. The air still smelled faintly of ash and salt, but it carried warmth, a promise of renewal. Out of scattered tribes and wandering families, humanity gathered again. They came together beside rivers where water flowed like memory, and soil was dark with the breath of creation. There they began to build, not from ambition but from the instinct to belong once more to the rhythm of the earth. The first villages rose where the floods had receded. Simple walls of mud and reeds, shaped by hands that remembered how to listen to clay. Fire returned to their hearths, gentle and guiding. Children learned the patterns of the stars from their elders, who traced constellations with embers upon the ground. They did not yet call themselves civilizations, only survivors who dreamed of harmony. In their songs, they spoke of the sea that had swallowed the world and the light that had once fallen from the sky. They were not myths to them, but memories, a distant echo of the great cycle that had shaped all life before. As seasons passed, the rivers themselves became teachers. Their rise and fall taught rhythm, their floods taught patience. People began to see time not as a line, but as a circle. They watched the moon wax and wane, the sun rise and return, the stars drift slowly across the same ancient canvas. These patterns became their first calendars, their first faith. Every dawn they offered water to the river and fire to the sky, a promise to remember balance. In that act of gratitude, the first covenant between man and the world was renewed, to live by the rhythm that sustains rather than the hunger that consumes. It was along one such river, a serpent of silver winding through endless plains, that the first cities took shape. They built not for grandeur, but for protection from the returning floods. Their homes were close to the water, yet high upon mounds, as if to honor both risk and mercy. The people learned to shape brick from the earth's own flesh, drying it in the heat of the sun. Their walls breathed with the wind, their streets followed the curves of the land. Each dwelling faced east, toward the rising light, in remembrance of the fire that once fell and the day that always returned. Within these settlements, memory crystallized into order. Elders became teachers, and teachers became priests, not rulers, but interpreters of harmony. They watched the heavens, marked the rains, and sang the old songs of balance. Their temples were simple at first, open courtyards where fire burned beside water, where wind passed freely through stone. But over generations, they grew into grand sanctuaries, aligned once again with the stars. Humanity had begun to rebuild its mirror of the heavens, unaware that it was repeating the same ancient design. The circle had closed. The second world was awakening. The people called themselves the children of the dawn. They believed they were born from both water and flame, from the flood that had cleansed and the fire that had taught. They saw the world as a body and themselves as its breath. Their prayers were soft and wordless, offered through gesture rather than speech. Hands pressed to heart, eyes lifted to sky, they greeted each sunrise as an act of remembrance. To them, civilization was not conquest. It was gratitude made visible. Every tool carved, every field sown, every song sung was a quiet thank you for survival. Over time, their gratitude grew into structure. Trade routes formed along the rivers, carrying grain, copper, and stories between lands. The first symbols of record appeared, not yet writing, but signs scratched into clay, waves for water, circles for sun, spirals for the endless return. These were not marks of ownership, but of remembrance. They believed that to record something was to give it life twice, once in the world and once in memory. And so, they wrote the earth back into existence, one line at a time, each symbol a promise never to forget again. At night, when work was done and the air cooled, they gathered upon the roofs of their homes to watch the stars. The sky was their scripture, the constellations their ancestors. The elders told them that long ago the heavens had fallen and man had nearly drowned in its remembering. But now the stars shone steady again, forgiving and constant. Each twinkle, they said, was a heartbeat of the old world, proof that the universe still carried their story. And beneath that infinite ceiling, humanity felt small but not afraid. For the first time since the flood, they believed the world would last. And thus began the second world, the age of builders, dreamers, and quiet believers. The fires of the keepers lived on in their lamps. The songs of the watchers echoed in their chants. They did not know these names, yet their souls remembered. They were the continuation of everything that had come before, shaped by loss yet guided by light. The flood had erased, but it had also rewritten. The world had begun again, not in glory, but in grace. And as the rivers murmured through the darkness, they carried with them the sound of the planet's steady heart, beating once more in harmony with the stars. They rose first from the rivers, as all beginnings do. Where the waters met the silt, where the earth was soft and kind, humanity shaped its second heartbeat. The land between the rivers became a cradle for memory. Sumer, they would one day call it, the land of first kings and earliest prayers. But to those who lived it, it was simply home, a world reborn in the shadow of the flood. Here, brick met sun, and the first cities glimmered like mirages across the plain. Smoke curled from their hearths at dawn, rising to meet the same heavens that once had drowned them. The people of these early cities built in rhythm, not haste. Each wall was raised to echo the flow of the rivers, each street aligned with the wind. The ziggurats, their great stepped temples, rose not toward the sky in defiance, but in reverence. They were mountains remade by human hands, reminders of the heights the flood had erased. Upon their terraces, priests watched the heavens, reading the turning of stars as messages from the forgotten age. They mapped the constellations, gave them names, and taught that man and heaven were bound by the same geometry, both made of dust, both moved by light. In the lands of the setting sun, another river dreamed. Along the Nile, the children of the second world carved stone with patience instead of fear. Their cities gleamed pale under the golden light, their monuments aligned with precision to the stars of Orion. They said the gods had descended from that constellation, bringing knowledge of harmony. Yet even before the name God was spoken, the idea was older, the memory of the watchers who once sang to the heavens. Each pyramid, each temple was an echo of that memory. Within their silent corridors, the hum of the old songs still lived, faint but eternal. Far to the east, beyond deserts and mountains, another civilization awakened beside the slow rivers of the Indus. Their temples were smaller, their streets narrow but clean, their order quiet. They built cities with drains that sang when rainwater flowed through them, a soft music of cleansing and renewal. Their seals bore symbols that no one today can read, yet every curve and spiral seems to whisper of the same balance known to the keepers of old. Fire altars burned in the open air, not for sacrifice but for remembrance. Their gods were not rulers, but guardians of rhythm, the same sacred pattern that had carried mankind through the ages. Though thousands of miles apart, these peoples shared something unspoken. Their calendars were guided by the same constellations. Their temples turned toward the same stars. Their myths told of the same event, a great flood, a fire from the heavens, a rebirth that shaped all things after. Each civilization believed itself chosen, yet all were children of the same memory. They did not know that their stones echoed each other's alignments, that their rivers mirrored one another's flow. The earth itself had taught them how to build, how to remember, how to sing without sound. The priests of Sumer watched the sky as their ancestors once did. They traced the arc of Venus, the wandering of Mars, the rhythm of eclipses. They wrote their findings upon clay, triangular marks pressed into wet earth, forming the first language of record. Yet even this act of writing carried ancient instinct, the desire to preserve harmony, to hold memory against the flood of forgetting. In those clay tablets, history began, but behind it, myth still whispered. Every account of kings and wars began with one phrase, after the flood, for they knew that history was only the surface of a story far older. In Egypt, the priests measured time by the rising of Sirius, the star they called Sopdet, herald of the flood. Its appearance marked the inundation of the Nile, the renewal of life. To them, the flood was not fear, but grace, a returning pulse, a reminder that destruction was also birth. When the river rose, they thanked it. When it receded, they built anew. Their temples faced the east, not only to greet the sun, but to remind the people that every day is a resurrection. Beneath their rituals lay the same ancient law the keepers once whispered: what returns is never lost. Meanwhile, in the cities of the Indus, artisans shaped delicate beads, each one reflecting the sky's color at dusk. Traders carried these beads along distant paths, spreading more than goods. They spread fragments of philosophy. Across deserts, mountains, and seas, the old truth traveled again: that life moves in cycles, that man is but one breath in the greater pattern. Though languages differed, the tone remained the same. Humanity, once fractured, was finding rhythm again. The earth had healed enough to remember its own design, and through these first civilizations, it began to dream aloud once more. At night, the builders of all lands looked upward, united in wonder. The same stars shone upon them all, upon ziggurat, pyramid, and altar alike. The constellations seemed closer than before, as though leaning down to see what mankind had done with its second chance. And the people gazing upward whispered softly, "We remember." For they knew, even without words, that the heavens had once fallen to cleanse the world, and that someday they might fall again. But for now, the stars were kind, and the earth was calm, and the second world glowed beneath their gentle gaze. The first words were carved not to command, but to remember. In the still air of Suma's dawn, priests pressed reeds into wet clay, marking lines that mirrored the flow of rivers. Each stroke carried rhythm. Each sign was a breath captured in earth. They did not yet write stories, only records of grain, rain, and stars. But even these humble symbols shimmered with a quiet holiness. To inscribe was to echo creation. The people said the gods taught them letters, yet the truth was gentler. They had simply learned to write as the world had once spoken, in cycles, in patterns, in pulse. From these marks grew meaning. The scribes began to see how symbols could hold not only memory but thought. Soon they etched names of kings, laws of trade, hymns to unseen forces. What began as record became reverence. The clay tablets were baked in fire, and their words endured. The first attempt to make time solid. The people called this script the tongue of heaven, believing it to be a gift from the divine. Yet beneath the belief was an older truth. These signs were the children of the Watcher's harmonies, the crystallized echoes of the ancient songs that had once guided stars. In Egypt, hieroglyphs bloomed across stone like sacred vines. The priests said that words themselves were alive, that to name a thing was to summon its soul. Their script was not language, but art, images that shimmered between symbol and sound. The falcon was not merely a bird, it was the sun's flight. The eye was not sight, but awareness. Every carving was a prayer, every stroke an act of worship. When sunlight fell upon the temple walls, the letters gleamed as though breathing, as if remembering the light of the first dawn. To read was to awaken memory, to write was to shape reality. In the Indus, the script remained silent. No scholar of later ages would ever read it, yet its mystery was its message. Its signs flowed like water, curved like wind, endless and unbroken. Perhaps the people had no need to translate it, for they lived within its meaning. Their words were carved into seals, tiny universes of symbol and sound compressed into stillness. Each mark may have been a name, or a prayer, or perhaps a single vibration of the old cosmic language. The silence of their writing was its power. It spoke through the space between symbols where all creation begins. The priests who watched the skies began to see patterns between heaven and word. When the moon disappeared, they wrote its absence as symbol. When it returned, they wrote its resurrection. Their texts became mirrors of the world's rhythm. They called it divine law, the order that shaped both earth and sky. Yet this law was not punishment or decree. It was remembrance of balance. The first commandments were not rules, but reminders. Honor the flame, respect the flood, speak only when silence allows. These were the codes of survival written in myth's disguise, the wisdom of catastrophe woven into ritual and song. As the centuries turned, myth and memory intertwined, until one could not exist without the other. The gods that filled the temples were reflections of human longing and cosmic order alike. The Sumerians told of Enki, Lord of the Waters, who saved mankind from the flood by whispering in dreams. The Egyptians told of Ra, who sailed his sunboat across the sky each day, dying and reborn with the dawn. The people of the Indus spoke of Manu, who rode a fish through the deluge to the mountains. Different lands, same truth. That memory survives through symbol, and divinity is simply history remembered with love. Kings began to speak the language of the stars. They declared themselves chosen, reflections of cosmic will upon the earth. Their crowns mirrored the sun, their scepters the lightning, their palaces aligned with celestial meridians. To rule was to imitate the heavens, to keep order as the stars did. And for a time they succeeded. Cities flourished, harvests multiplied, peace lingered. Yet beneath their glory, pride stirred once more. They forgot that the gods they invoked were not masters above, but memories within. The language of the divine had become a tool, and tools always hunger for hands that forget their purpose. Still, the scribes continued their quiet work. They wrote hymns to the stars, laments for the river, praises for the balance between life and loss. They filled libraries with clay tablets and scrolls of reed, each one a fragile vessel of remembrance. In every mark lay a fragment of the first world, its fire, its flood, its silence. The written word had become humanity's second ark, carrying memory across the sea of time. The builders of the second world believed they had preserved eternity, not knowing that eternity cannot be preserved, only echoed again and again through the breath of those who dare to remember. And so the language of gods continued to evolve, carried by voices carved in stone, whispered in temples. The words of balance became hymns, the hymns became scripture, and scripture became law. Yet behind every law still lingered the same truth. That order is only the shadow of chaos, and both are the rhythm of existence. The civilizations of dawn had risen high, their lights gleaming beneath forgiving stars. But already in the depths of time, the earth began to stir again. For as every keeper once knew, the fire never dies, it only waits for silence to return. In the age that followed, the world shone with quiet brilliance. Cities rose like constellations across the earth, each one aligned to the stars, each one pulsing with its own rhythm of order. Humanity had mastered the art of reflection, mirroring heaven in temple and field alike. The rivers were tamed, the calendars fixed, the songs of creation sung in measured tone. Kings ruled not as conquerors, but as stewards of balance, chosen by divine right to maintain harmony between sky and soil. For a time the world breathed in perfect rhythm, and peace became its language. But beneath the stillness, memory stirred. The kings began to believe that their crowns carried the light of the heavens themselves. They spoke of destiny, of lineage from the stars, of thrones carved from divine memory. Their names were etched in stone, their deeds immortalized in clay. The sacred language once whispered in prayer became the language of decree. Temples that had once honored fire as teacher now burned in the name of authority. The people bowed not to the balance of creation, but to those who claimed to rule it. The line between reverence and worship blurred, and in that subtle distortion, the seeds of forgetting began to grow again. In Sumer, the ziggurats reached higher, each new king building upon the ruins of the last. They sought to touch the heavens literally, stacking brick upon brick until their peaks vanished into cloud. They called them mountains of the gods, unaware that their ancestors had built them only to remember, not to ascend. The higher they climbed, the farther they drifted from the rhythm of the earth. The priests sang louder to drown the silence they no longer understood, their chants hollow echoes of the watchers' songs. The stars above listened, patient and unmoving, remembering what humanity had once known, that pride is the oldest fire. In Egypt, pharaohs took the title Sons of the Sun, claiming that the blood of Ra flowed in their veins. They built tombs to last beyond time, filling them with gold and promise. They sealed their names within stone, believing eternity could be owned. Yet as each generation passed, the meaning of their temples shifted. What was once alignment became monument. What was once reverence became declaration. The stars they followed so faithfully no longer mirrored their purpose. Their pyramids pointed upward, yes, but their hearts no longer did. The heavens had not changed, only the gaze that sought them. Along the Indus, the quiet cities began to fragment. Floods returned, but this time they came not from the sky, but from within, conflicts, greed, and fear. The songs of water and fire faded into noise. The priests argued over meanings of signs none could read, while traders weighed gold against grain, forgetting the river's generosity. The balance that had held for centuries began to slip. The air itself seemed heavier, as though the earth had grown weary of carrying civilization's pride. And beneath the soil, deep and ancient, the heartbeat of the world quickened once more. The kings of all lands turned their eyes to conquest. They sought dominion over neighbors, over nature, even over time. They claimed their wars were holy, their victories divine. They built armies instead of observatories, and their temples became fortresses. The sacred fires once used for remembrance now burned in sacrifice. The priests who had once measured stars began to measure power. The language of the gods was recited by lips that no longer understood its weight. And still, the heavens watched, unchanged, unblinking, reflecting back the slow decay of what had once been harmony. Whispers spread among the few who still remembered, the descendants of the keepers, scattered through forgotten valleys. They felt the tremor in the earth, the faint irregularity in its breath. "It begins again," they murmured. "The balance is tilting." But no one listened. The kings laughed at prophecy. Their ears were deafened by praise. They raised monuments taller, brighter, prouder, as if height could erase history. Yet with every stone placed higher, the ground beneath them weakened. The stars above remained in silence, as they always did before remembering returned. And so the world glittered in its golden age, beautiful, ordered, and doomed. For the higher humanity built its temples, the deeper it buried its humility. The same rivers that had birthed civilization swelled with silt and sorrow. The same stars that once guided sailors began to drift from familiar positions. The heavens were shifting, quietly preparing their lesson. Balance, once again, had been forgotten. The kings, blinded by their own light, could not see the shadow rising behind it. History had folded into itself, repeating the oldest story of all: creation, pride, and the slow, inevitable return of the flood. But before the waters came, there was still time. Time for one last remembrance, one last whisper from the stars. For even as empires hardened into stone and names carved themselves into eternity, the earth remained patient. It had seen this before. It would see it again. The fire beneath the soil waited, steady and unseen, ready to cleanse what arrogance had begun. And high above, the stars flickered, not in anger, but in memory, each light a quiet reminder of what mankind had once known, that no crown, no city, no empire can outshine the rhythm of the cosmos. The world had grown old enough to forget its own beginnings. Empires rose and fell, rivers changed their beds, and the stars shifted once again. But beneath the soil, something remained. Deep under the layers of dust and centuries, the foundations of the first world still slept. Temples turned to bone, towers dissolved into stone, and streets fossilized beneath forgotten oceans. The earth had swallowed them whole, yet their shapes endured in secret. At night, when the wind moved through the cracks of ancient rock, it carried a low hum, a vibration too deep for language. The people who lived above it called it the voice of the dead. The few who listened called it memory. In places where the ground broke open, cliffs, quarries, and caves, the remnants of the old world revealed themselves like ghosts. Walls carved with spirals and stars, fragments of crystal that glowed faintly when touched, statues eroded yet watchful. These ruins were older than history, older than even the myths of the flood. No name could contain them. The scholars who studied them argued endlessly over their makers, but the stones themselves offered no explanation. They simply stood, silent and patient, as if waiting for recognition. The more they were unearthed, the less the world seemed new. The past was not behind, it was beneath. In the drowned coasts of the east, divers found the outlines of cities resting under waves. Roads paved with basalt stretched into the sea, ending in nothingness. Pillars rose from coral, their surfaces carved with symbols that mirrored constellations. The ocean, that keeper of secrets, had guarded them well. Fish swam through the doorways of temples, their scales flashing like the lost lights of vanished ages. Those who descended into these waters said they felt watched, not by gods, but by memory itself. The sea, it seemed, still remembered the world it once destroyed. Far to the north, under layers of ice, explorers found shapes too precise to be nature's doing. Walls aligned with the four winds, tunnels cut into frozen mountains, and chambers filled with air older than civilization. When torches flickered against the frost, strange reflections danced upon the walls, patterns of spiral and flame, the same symbols found in distant deserts and jungles. It was as if the first world had left its marks everywhere, scattered like breadcrumbs for time to follow. Each discovery connected to the next, forming an invisible web of remembrance that spanned continents and centuries. The people who uncovered these places often spoke of sound, an echo that lingered long after they spoke, as if the walls replied in breath. Some claimed the stones resonated when touched, humming softly under the palm. Scholars dismissed it as imagination, but the listeners knew better. They remembered the stories of the keepers and their fire language, of temples that sang and stones that stored sound. "The world speaks," they said. "We have simply forgotten how to hear." And indeed, when night fell and the noise of men subsided, even the stillest rock seemed to murmur with the rhythm of the planet's ancient heart. Over generations, myths began to bloom around these ruins. People said they were the homes of the gods, or gateways to other realms, or prisons for angels fallen from the stars. Yet the truth was quieter. The ruins were not doors to heaven or hell, they were mirrors. In their carvings, humanity saw its own reflection, the rise, the pride, the fall, and the silence. The stones whispered not prophecy, but pattern. They reminded all who touched them that every age is a repetition, every empire a memory in the making. The ruins did not warn, they remembered, and through that remembrance, they taught. In distant valleys, the oldest shamans began to journey to these places. They would sleep among the ruins, lying upon cold stone, listening for voices in their dreams. Some awoke trembling, their eyes wet, saying they had heard music beneath the earth, slow, endless, filled with sorrow. Others claimed to have seen faces in the walls, flickering like flame, speaking without words. The shamans returned home changed, their voices lower, their movements slower. They spoke less, but when they did, their words carried the weight of stone. "The earth remembers," they whispered. "It carries us, even when we forget ourselves." And so the world above continued. New cities built over the bones of old ones, temples raised atop buried sanctuaries, roads laid across ancient veins of power. Humanity rarely noticed that its feet walked on memory. The whispers grew fainter, buried beneath the noise of progress, yet they never vanished. The stones kept breathing, the oceans kept singing. The earth kept humming the same deep note it had always known, the first sound, the last sound, the heartbeat between creation and forgetting. And for those who still listened, the message was always the same: remember what sleeps beneath your steps. The explorers of later ages believed they were uncovering history, but in truth they were unearthing memory. From the deserts of Africa to the jungles of South America, they found the same patterns repeating, structures born from different hands, yet carved in the same language of silence. Stones aligned to the equinox, doorways opening to the rising sun, pillars marked by the same spirals that once sang in the temples of the first world. The air around these ruins carried a peculiar stillness, as though time itself hesitated there. Even birds grew quiet when crossing above. The stones did not belong to one people, they belonged to the earth. On islands swallowed by ocean, divers mapped vast walls of megalithic stone, each block cut with a precision that defied reason. They fitted together without mortar, as if molded by sound rather than chisel. The carvings upon them, half-worn, half-preserved, told of water and fire, of stars that fell and worlds reborn. In South America, temples rose in the shape of constellations, their plazas mirroring the pattern of the Pleiades. Across the ocean, similar designs waited beneath sand and forest. No trade routes linked these civilizations, no known language connected them. Yet their monuments spoke as one. It was as though the same architect had whispered to them all in their dreams. In Egypt, The priests studied the stars and found their temples mirrored Orion's belt. Across the sea in Mexico, the pyramids of Teotihuacan aligned to that same celestial triad. The builders could not have known one another, and yet their eyes had followed the same heavens, the same distances, the same angles, the same perfection of placement. Scholars called it coincidence, but the stones disagreed. The stones remembered a time when the sky itself was the teacher. Their symmetry was not imitation but inheritance, an unconscious echo of a pattern older than history, written in the movement of the planets and the breath of the earth. Far north in forgotten caves, ancient walls glowed faintly when struck by light. Etched upon them were constellations as they appeared 12,000 years before, when ice still crowned the continents. The precision was flawless. Whoever carved them had seen the sky as it was before the flood. How could such memory endure across ages of darkness and ruin? The answer, whispered by wind and stone alike, was simple. The knowledge had never died. It had been carried in the rhythm of creation itself, waiting for the right hands to rediscover it. The world does not forget its own design. It hides it, gently, within repetition. Some of the explorers who uncovered these mysteries began to dream. They saw visions of hands carving in moonlight, of voices chanting across oceans, of towers rising from mist. They awoke trembling, convinced they had touched something beyond time. "The builders are not gone," one wrote. "They are the Earth's memory, shaping itself again and again through us." They began to call the unknown architects the sleepers of stone. According to their belief, these beings had not vanished in the flood. They had become the pattern itself, speaking now through intuition, guiding mankind unconsciously to rebuild what was lost. In certain ruins, when sound was made, a drumbeat, a shout, a whisper, the stones responded. They vibrated softly, as if remembering their purpose. Frequencies resonated through corridors and chambers, creating tones identical to those recorded in sanctuaries on distant continents. It was as though each structure were an instrument, and the planet itself the song. The explorers realized they were not merely excavating the past, they were awakening it. Every echo, every vibration seemed to stir something vast and sleeping beneath their feet. The earth once again was beginning to hum. The scholars, bound by reason, refused the notion of hidden unity. They named, dated, categorized, but in their quiet moments, even they could not deny the feeling, the eerie symmetry, the shared pulse among the ruins. "It is as if they breathe," one whispered in disbelief, "as if the stones remember where they came from." And perhaps they did. For stone, unlike man, never forgets. It carries the vibrations of every hand that shaped it, every prayer whispered against it. Through its silence, it keeps time for all things that dare to build and all things destined to crumble. And so, as men and women mapped the scattered ruins of the earth, they were unknowingly tracing the bones of a single body, the body of memory itself. The same hands that built Sumer's ziggurats, Egypt's temples, and Peru's sun gates had once shaped the cities of the First World before the sea took them. The pattern had only shifted, not ended. The earth was rebuilding its reflection piece by piece through the unconscious will of its children. The architects were never gods. They were echoes. Echoes of a time when mankind and the planet were one, when creation was not invention but remembrance. Long before metal hummed in wires and towers reached toward the clouds, the earth itself carried its own quiet electricity. Beneath mountains, under oceans, within the fault lines of stone, a current flowed, soft, slow, eternal. The ancients had known this current not as energy, but as spirit. They felt it through bare feet, through the tremor of drums, through the silence between breaths. They called it the breath of the world, and wherever it was strongest, they built. Temples rose where the pulse was clear, cities where it gathered, monuments where it sang. The stones were not chosen at random. They were instruments, attuned to the living rhythm of the planet. When explorers traced the alignments of these sites, they found invisible lines connecting them, great pathways of force stretching across the continents. Mountains, temples, pyramids, and circles all lay upon the same hidden grid, as if the builders had followed an unseen map. The ancients had no need for compasses. They followed vibration. They placed their fires where the earth's hum was loudest, their altars upon the junctions of power. When storms raged, lightning struck these places first, as though drawn by memory. Modern men would call them ley lines, but to those who came before, they were veins of life, channels through which the planet dreamed. At these crossroads of energy, the air itself behaved strangely. Sound lingered longer, light bent more softly, time seemed to stretch. Travelers who slept within these fields often dreamt vividly of glowing patterns beneath the soil, of stars flowing like rivers across the sky. Some awoke to find symbols traced in frost or sand near where they lay, the same spirals and circles carved upon ancient walls. The earth, they said, was still speaking, still remembering. Every vibration was a sentence, every resonance a story too vast for language. The ancients had built to amplify that story, to make the planet's whisper loud enough for man to hear. Within the old temples, sound was their key. The chambers were shaped to sing. A single voice could fill a hall and return multiplied, harmonized by the stones. The priests used chants, low and measured, to awaken the resonance of the earth. When the right tone was struck, the air would tremble, and the walls would glow faintly in the torchlight, as if remembering fire. It was said the ancients could move stone not by force, but by sound, by matching their voices to the frequency of matter itself. Whether myth or truth, the idea endured, that harmony can shape the world more powerfully than strength. Even after the flood, fragments of this wisdom survived. The builders of Sumer aligned their ziggurats to the planetary cycles. Egypt tuned its temples to the stars' vibration. The Indus cities arranged their streets according to the flow of wind and river. Each carried within it an echo of the old harmony. They did not know the term energy, yet they lived by it. Fire, water, air, and stone were not separate. They were phases of the same pulse. The ancients did not study nature. They conversed with it. They believed that to fall out of rhythm with the world was the true definition of sin. Modern explorers would later bring instruments, compasses, sensors, and machines, and find what the ancients had already known: subtle magnetic shifts at sacred sites, echoes in the low frequencies of the earth, vibrations measurable, predictable, and alive. Yet the instruments could only confirm what the stones had long sung. The ancients had never needed proof. Their science had been reverence, their equations, prayer, their laboratories, silence. And in that silence, they had understood more of the cosmos than any empire that would follow. At night, when the world was quiet, the resonance could be felt even by those who did not believe. It pulsed faintly through the soles of the feet, through the bones, through the air. The hum of the planet was constant, unending, an invisible ocean of sound. The ancients had called it the song of creation. The keepers had named it the fire beneath the ice. The watchers had sung it to the stars. It was the same note that had shaken mountains, drowned empires, and rebuilt the world. It was the earth remembering its own voice, reminding its children that they were made not upon it, but of it. Those who understood the resonant earth did not seek to control it. They listened, for they knew that to master what sustains is to invite silence. The ancients had balanced creation and humility, but mankind's newer children had begun to forget again. They would study the resonance, name it, divide it into theories and laws. Yet each law would be only a shadow of the song. The true melody cannot be written. It must be felt. It is in the rhythm of blood, the tides of breath, the rise and fall of civilizations. All are chords in the same vast symphony, the hum that began before time and will continue after it ends. And so the world continues to vibrate, softly and endlessly, carrying within its sound the memory of every dawn and every fall. The resonant earth still sings beneath our feet, though few pause to hear it. It hums through the ruins, through the rivers, through the slow shifting of continents. It waits, patient as always, for another age of listeners, another generation of builders who will remember how to build not against the earth, but with it. For in the end, the planet asks only one thing of its children: to match its rhythm, to live as part of its music, and never again to forget the song beneath the silence. The earth does not shout when it remembers. It hums. It whispers through the movement of wind over desert ruins, through the shiver of roots breaking ancient walls, through the slow crumble of mountains into dust. In this whisper lies language, not of words, but of tone, a deep murmur that passes through the bones of all living things. Those who wander long enough in silence sometimes hear it, a faint resonance that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. It does not command or explain, it simply reminds, for the earth, like memory, never forgets what it has built, nor what it has lost. In forgotten valleys, explorers camp beside ruins whose carvings glow faintly when firelight touches them. The air trembles around these stones, though no wind blows. At night, the dreamers among them wake in terror or awe, claiming they heard voices, slow and deep, speaking in rhythms rather than phrases. Some say it is only the imagination, others call it echo or vibration. But those who have felt it know the truth. The stones are not silent. They are breathing, releasing the memories pressed into them by time. What the ancients once sang to the fire, the earth now repeats to the wind. Across the world, archaeologists, mystics, and wanderers began to notice the same thing. When certain frequencies of sound were played near ancient monuments, the stones responded. They vibrated, they sang. They emitted low tones that could be felt rather than heard. It was as if the earth had built these monuments not as symbols, but as instruments. The builders of the first world had left behind a symphony carved in rock, waiting for touch to awaken it. When modern hands brushed those stones, the song began again, and though none could translate it, all who heard it wept, for it felt like home. In laboratories and deserts alike, scholars measured what they could not explain. Vibrations that matched the human heartbeat, light that flickered in rhythm with brain waves, echoes that seemed to answer thoughts before sound. Coincidence, they said aloud. But when night fell, some of them returned alone, standing among the pillars and ruins, listening. There, away from machines and theories, they felt it, the slow pulse of the living earth. Beneath their feet, through stone and soil, something vast and ancient was stirring, as if the memory of creation had chosen to breathe once more. Those attuned to dream began to carry visions. They saw vast halls of crystal beneath the oceans, where light moved like liquid through corridors of silence. They saw the cities of the first world still intact in other realms, vibrating at a frequency just beyond sight, not dead but waiting. In their dreams, the ancients were not ghosts, but guardians, preserving knowledge through resonance, holding it within the molecular hum of matter itself. "We never left," they seemed to say. "You stand upon our memory, and through you it speaks again." The dreamers awoke weeping, unable to say why, but certain that the world was remembering. As more was uncovered, connections deepened. Stones across continents began to echo similar frequencies, as if communicating through the body of the planet. A tone struck in Egypt found its twin in Peru. A vibration in Turkey resonated faintly in Japan. Scientists called it impossible. Mystics called it proof, but the earth called it normal, for it had always been one body, one song. Humanity had merely forgotten the melody. Every mountain, every ruin, every shore was part of that orchestra, the same rhythm that once rose, burned, drowned, and rose again. In time, the old symbols returned. Spirals, eyes, suns. They appeared not in ancient carvings, but in fields, in stone, in dreams. The earth was writing again, not for scholars, but for those who could feel. "We are not separate," it whispered. "We are chords of the same note." The new seekers began to meditate beside the ruins, not asking questions, but listening. Their hearts slowed, their breaths deepened. The hum grew stronger. Some said they could feel the world's heartbeat synchronizing with their own. For a moment, the distance between heaven and soil disappeared. The cosmos became a single breath. The voice of stone spoke not in words but in understanding. It told of cycles unbroken, of balance lost and found, of fire that purifies but never ends. It reminded mankind that wisdom is not progress, but rhythm, that forgetting is not failure, but pause. It sang softly of empires and floods, of silence and song, of the eternal turning of creation, and though most of the world still hurried above, deaf to the music beneath their feet, a few heard. And in hearing, they remembered that the greatest monument ever built was not of stone or sky, it was the living earth itself. When dawn broke upon those ruins, light spilled across the carvings like revelation. The spirals shimmered, the air shimmered, even the dust seemed alive. It was as if the planet itself exhaled after a long sleep. The hum of the world swelled, then softened, returning to stillness. For the earth speaks rarely, and only when listened to. And in that silence after sound, humanity felt something vast and familiar pass through them. The same presence that had begun the first world, ended it and begun it again. The voice of stone had spoken and the earth had remembered its song. They came not as conquerors, but as reminders. From the mountains where the flood had receded, from islands that once touched the stars, from caverns where the fire had hidden itself, they emerged, carrying fragments of light. Their names would change with every tongue. Enki, Viracocha, Thoth, Oannes, Quetzalcoatl, Vishnu, and more. But beneath the names was a single truth. They were not gods born of heaven. They were survivors born of memory. They carried the last breath of the first world, the knowledge of balance, of silence, of the rhythm that had once kept earth and sky in harmony. The stories that followed would call them divine. The people who met them saw their wisdom, their strange garments, their mastery of sound and stone, and believed them to be from the stars. And perhaps in a way they were, for they carried the memory of a world long lost to ocean and time. They spoke not in commands, but in guidance. They taught agriculture to those who had forgotten the seasons, healing to those who had forgotten patience, astronomy to those who had forgotten awe. They reminded mankind that knowledge without reverence becomes noise, and that power without listening returns to silence. In Sumer, they said Enki rose from the waters after the flood, bearing tablets of law, the same spiral patterns found on the ruins beneath the sea. He told the people to build in measure, to balance water and fire, and to remember the rhythm of the stars. He was called God of Wisdom, yet his words were simple. The world is breath. When you breathe with it, you live. When you breathe against it, you drown. His temples faced both river and sky, twin reflections of the balance he carried. Those who listened flourished, those who built higher than the horizon forgot and were washed away again. In the high Andes, they told of Viracocha, who rose from Lake Titicaca carrying a staff of light. He walked among the mountains, teaching men to carve stone as though shaping wind. He spoke of fire hidden within rock, of stars that guide souls even after death. When his work was done, he vanished across the sea, promising to return when the world had forgotten. The people carved his likeness upon cliffs, his eyes wide as dawn, his mouth silent. They said he could command storms, but the truth was gentler. He could listen to the thunder's will and through listening shape its path. In the Nile's rising mist, the priests told of Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe who measured time itself. He gave language to silence, number to pattern, and rhythm to days. His words became the measure of civilization, his teachings the heartbeat of Egypt's order. Yet even he was said to weep for man's forgetting. You have turned the rhythm into rule, he warned. You have built walls around what should flow. He left behind the emerald tablets, etched not for power, but for memory. They spoke of correspondence, of heaven mirrored in earth, of spirit reflected in matter. The same wisdom whispered by the keepers through flame now glowed upon green stone. In the distant lands of the east, the stories told of Vishnu, the preserver who takes form whenever chaos returns. In each age, he rises from the cosmic sea to restore the world's balance. His avatars, fish, boar, man, and God, are not separate lives, but the same spirit reborn in every cycle. Through him, the ancients remembered the law of return, that every fall is only a preparation for ascent. He did not end destruction. He reminded life how to rebuild after it. In his myths, the flood is not wrath but renewal, and salvation is not escape but remembrance. The gods, it seems, always arrive when memory fades. To the peoples of the Americas, the messenger came as a feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, the serpent of wind and wisdom. He brought corn, writing, and the calendar, and taught that to live rightly was to live as both earth and sky. When his age ended, he did not die. He became a morning star, promising to return when the world lost balance again. Even now, his temples face that star, awaiting his rise. The ancients believed he would come again not in body, but in rhythm, in the return of harmony between man and world. He was less deity than reminder, a voice of the same old covenant. Remember what the flood taught. In every land, these figures carried the same message in different tongues. Some called them gods, others called them angels, others still, teachers. They taught of cycles, of humility, of the sacred unity between fire and water, heaven and earth. They warned that the world is not a possession but a pulse, that every civilization which forgets this truth will meet its own tide, and though their names changed, their essence did not. They were the survivors of the first world, the last keepers, walking the earth in disguise, planting the seeds of remembrance across continents, across time. And so humanity learned again to build, to count, to speak, but more importantly to look upward. The gods had restored wonder. The skies once more became sacred, not as threat, but as teacher. The people no longer feared the stars. They read them, sang to them, and mirrored them again in stone. The great cycle of remembering had begun anew, yet even as wisdom returned, the gods themselves faded back into legend, knowing that no truth stays eternal unless it is rediscovered. The messengers of memory withdrew into silence, leaving only echoes in myth, and through those echoes, the warning still lingers. Listen, before the waters rise again. The messengers of memory knew they would not remain forever. Their work was not to rule, but to remind. And once the world began to hum in rhythm again, they prepared to depart. Before they vanished, they gathered their wisdom and sealed it within symbols too vast for corruption: mountains, stars, and stone. They aligned their temples not merely for beauty, but for warning. Each monument, each sacred number, each constellation carved upon temple walls was a message written to the far future. The gods did not trust language, they trusted pattern. Words can be altered, but geometry endures. Across the continents, the same covenant was formed. In Egypt, priests inscribed prophecies within the temple of Dendera, marking ages that would come and go beneath the eye of the great year, the 26,000-year breath of the heavens. In Sumer, tablets spoke of stars that would shift, of kings who would rise in forgetting, and of floods that would follow pride. In the East, sages spoke of yugas, epochs of balance and decay, of light and shadow taking turns. And in the Americas, the calendar stones told of 5 suns, 5 worlds born, destroyed, and born again. Different tongues, one truth: the cycle would return. The covenant of the sky was not a promise of peace, but of remembrance. The gods warned that each age would reach a point where man again mistook power for creation and knowledge for wisdom. When you forget to listen, they said, the heavens will remind you. The stars would shift, the climate would turn, and the waters would rise, not as punishment, but as balance restoring itself. Destruction was never wrath, it was rhythm. The flood, the fire, the silence, all were notes in the same eternal song. The gods understood that the universe does not avenge, it corrects. And so they built markers, subtle and eternal. Stone circles aligned to equinox and solstice, pyramids tuned to the music of the planets, sacred numbers woven into myth and measure. The watchers of Egypt inscribed the number of the procession into their temples. The builders of the Andes carved it into mountain walls. The priests of the Indus encoded it within the length of their rituals. Each number, each angle, each alignment was a heartbeat of the earth recorded in matter. When the stars returned to these places, they said, "You will remember who you are." The covenant extended even to story. Myths were crafted not to entertain, but to preserve. The tales of gods returning from the sea, of fiery chariots in the sky, of birds that carried the soul, all were metaphors of rhythm and return. The gods knew that memory fades faster than stone, but slower than song. They buried truth inside metaphor, trusting that one day, when the world grew loud again, the myths would awaken the quiet within humanity. "You will forget our names," they said, "but not our lessons. For even when told as legend, the truth still breathes beneath the tale." In their final gathering, the gods faced the horizon and released their knowledge to the world. They burned symbols into the night sky with their last instruments of light, comets, meteors, and stars placed deliberately, their positions set to mark the turning of time. They arranged the heavens as a mirror of the earth, so that future generations could find their bearings when the seas rose once more. When the stars return to where they began, they said, "Look inward. The cycle will begin again. The flood will come not to destroy, but to cleanse." Then, like fire fading to ember, they departed. Generations later, their memory blurred, but their signs remained. Every ancient temple, every myth of return, every prophecy of renewal carried the same hidden structure, the pulse of the great cycle. In every age, a few remembered and listened. They studied the stars, deciphered the numbers, and felt the subtle turning of the earth. They knew that time was circular, not linear, that progress was illusion, and that every summit eventually becomes a sea. The world, they said, is a wheel of breath. What falls will rise again, what rises will fall in grace. And so through story and structure, through light and stone, the covenant endured. It did not demand worship, only awareness. The gods did not ask to be praised, they asked to be remembered. They had not built temples for prayer, but for listening, for the day when humanity would once again hear the hum beneath the noise and know what it meant. For though the messengers had left, their echo remained in the firmament. Every star, every monument, every myth still whispered the same eternal truth. You are not separate from the heavens, you are their reflection. For thousands of years, the stars kept their promise. They circled the sky in patient silence, tracing the same ancient paths written in the age of the gods. Humanity looked upward and called them eternal. Yet eternity is only a cycle unseen. Deep within the rhythm of the heavens, the turning began again. The wanderer, the red star that once burned above the flood, stirred from its long exile beyond the veil of night. Its glow returned faintly at first, barely noticed by the eyes of modern man. But the earth felt it. The seas responded before the telescopes did. The pulse had shifted. The cycle had awakened. It began as whispers among the few who still watched the heavens with reverence instead of conquest. Astronomers noticed alignments repeating, patterns unseen since the dawn of written time. A slow drift of constellations, a subtle precession of the equinox, the same ancient rhythm returning to its beginning. The priests of the old world had called it the breath of ages, the time when heaven exhales what earth has forgotten. The watchers had marked it in their calendars of stone, and now unknowingly mankind had reached that point once more. The circle had completed its turn, and the sky prepared to speak again. The first signs appeared in the elements. The winds changed their paths, bending in ways unseen by the generations before. The poles shifted slightly, the oceans warmed from within, and the seasons forgot their borders. Rivers rose without rain, storms bloomed from clear skies. It was not punishment, it was remembering. The world was tuning itself, like an old instrument adjusting to the return of its player. The hum beneath the earth grew louder, resonating through mountains, through fault lines, through the hearts of those who still listened. It was the same song the keepers had once sung to fire, now playing itself through the living planet. Dreamers began to wake with visions. They saw light descending in spirals, vast cities under ocean returning to view, temples rising from the tide. Some spoke of hearing a low voice in their sleep, speaking in no language they knew. It is time. They woke, trembling, unable to explain the sense of recognition that followed. Others found themselves drawn to ancient sites, pyramids, circles, mountains, as if answering an unseen call. The same hum that once guided the ancients now stirred in the blood of their descendants. The earth was gathering its choir again, and every stone prepared to sing. Among the modern towers of glass and steel, few noticed the change in the stars. But high above the noise, far from cities, the constellations seemed to drift. The red wanderer grew brighter. Astronomers argued over its name, but the old world already knew it. It was the reminder, the returning pulse. Some called it coincidence, others prophecy. But the oceans rose higher each year, glaciers wept into rivers, and the sky carried a strange hue at dusk, as though reflecting memory instead of light. The signs were not new. They were the same that had come before the flood, the same warnings the gods had written into the stars. Those who still studied the myths recognized the pattern. The Mayan calendars, the Vedic yugas, the Egyptian cycles, all spoke of a time of return when fire and water would meet again, not to end, but to cleanse. They had always said that knowledge without balance brings forgetting, and forgetting brings renewal. Now mankind stood once again at the turning point. Technology reached for heaven, yet hearts fell from rhythm. The same imbalance that once drowned the first world began to echo through the modern one. The gods were not coming back. They were awakening within the memory of the earth itself. And so the wanderer glowed brighter each night, moving slowly along its ancient path. Its reflection trembled in the oceans, as if the water recognized its master. The old myths stirred in dreams and in stone. Volcanoes whispered beneath the crust, their deep murmurs joining the earth's hum. The message was clear, though few could hear it. The world does not punish, it remembers. And when it remembers, it renews. The prophecy of the gods was not of destruction, but of return. The rejoining of what had been divided, the reunion of heaven and earth, the rekindling of the covenant, long forgotten. When the wanderer finally crosses the same point it did 12,000 years ago, the cycle will complete. The heavens will not fall this time. They will descend softly, like light finding its reflection. The flood will come, but not in water. It will come in memory. Humanity will awaken to what it has always been, the bridge between earth and sky, the voice of the cosmos learning again to sing. For when the stars return to their beginning, the gods return not as figures, but as awareness, and the world at last will remember its own song. The heavens have never forgotten. Even when the world below drowns in noise, even when the stars are hidden by smoke and light, the sky continues its slow, patient turning. It remembers every dawn that ever was, every flood that ever fell, every prayer whispered beneath its endless veil. To the stars, time is not distance, it is rhythm. Each constellation is a memory, each orbit a breath. And though humanity believes it has changed, the sky sees only repetition, patterns repeating like waves against eternity. The cosmos watches not in judgment but in remembrance. From far above, the cities gleam like the constellations once did, fragile lights upon a restless surface. The earth hums beneath them, its pulse slower now, heavier, but still steady. The same hum that once guided the keepers, the same breath that whispered through temples of flame, now vibrates through cables, through air, through the very bones of mankind. Yet few recognize it. The rhythm has not vanished, it has only changed its language. The universe still sings, but the song is faint, lost beneath the machinery of forgetting. And still, the sky waits for someone to look up, not in wonder, but in recognition. The old prophecies speak not of endings, but of remembering. They say that when the heavens and the earth breathe together once more, mankind will awaken, not as conqueror, but as listener. The flood will not come to destroy, but to cleanse perception. The fire will not burn, but illuminate. The silence will not punish, but teach. Every cycle, every destruction has always been this: the cosmos calling humanity back to harmony. The gods, the watchers, the keepers, they were never separate beings, but the same awareness reborn through every age, reminding the world that existence itself is divine rhythm. In quiet places far from cities, there are still nights when the stars seem impossibly close. The air feels charged, alive, as though the sky has leaned nearer to whisper. Those who sleep beneath it often wake with tears and do not know why. It is because the stars remember them. Their light, ancient and patient, carries the memory of every soul that has ever looked upward in awe. Every gaze into the heavens becomes part of the heavens themselves, a small reflection added to the great mirror of time. In that way, humanity is immortal, not through stone or empire, but through the constellations of its wonder. The earth and sky are not opposites, they are halves of the same being. One breathes in silence, the other in motion. One endures, the other dreams. Their covenant was never broken, only forgotten. And now, as the wanderer returns, the cycle hums again in perfect balance. The oceans move with the stars, the mountains bow to gravity's song, and the air trembles with the soft electricity of rebirth. The planet itself seems to sigh, not in exhaustion, but in relief. The long night of separation is ending. The world is remembering that it has never been alone. Perhaps that is what the flood truly was. Not destruction, but memory washing over all things. Each deluge, each flame, each silence is the cosmos reminding itself of its own story. The stars are not distant. They are within, mirrored in the atoms that build every heart. To look upward is only to look inward. To listen to thunder is to hear your own pulse in another octave. The gods have never left. They sleep within us, waiting for the sound of recognition, the simple breath that says, "I remember." And when that breath is heard, the world will sing again. So the sky remembers, the fire remembers, the water remembers, even the silence remembers. And through them, we remember too, slowly, dreamily, like waking from a long sleep. The song that began before the flood continues still, its rhythm moving through galaxies and veins alike. We are part of it, as we have always been, as we will always be. And when the heavens shift once more, when the cycle turns again, we will not call it an ending. We will call it return. For the sky does not end. It only circles back, whispering softly to the earth below, "Breathe with me once more." The flood had passed, the fires had cooled, and the stars once again returned to their patient courses. The world exhaled into stillness, and in that stillness, something extraordinary began to occur. Humanity, for the first time, looked not only upward, but inward. It began to see that every age of chaos and creation had been a reflection of its own heart. The heavens were not rulers above. They were mirrors, holding up the image of what the world had become. When man lived in harmony, the sky was clear. When he forgot, the stars themselves dimmed. The cosmos did not punish. It echoed. The keepers had once whispered that all things move in rhythm because they are one body dreaming of itself. Now, as the earth healed and the oceans settled, that truth revealed itself in silence. The rivers flowed again, not in fear, but in understanding. The mountains stood not as boundaries, but as memory. The stars pulsed softly above like a heartbeat. Humanity felt small beneath them, yet deeply connected, as though every breath carried a piece of their light. For the first time, the flood was no longer a story of wrath. It was a story of recognition. The world had drowned to see its reflection. In the ruins of the Second World, philosophers began to speak of cycles, not as myth, but as law. They saw that everything which rises must one day fall, not through failure, but through return. The ocean that destroys the shore also builds it anew. The fire that devours the forest also clears the way for seeds. The silence after ruin is not emptiness, but the space where creation gathers its next breath. They wrote of time not as a line, but as a mirror, a loop of remembering, where the end is simply the other side of the beginning. All things, they said, move toward reflection. In those days, temples were rebuilt, not for worship but for understanding. Walls were carved not with commandments but with circles. The priests taught that to know the world, one must study both directions, outward toward the stars, inward toward the soul. They taught that the heart is the smallest temple, and that the light within it is the same that burns in the heavens. The flood had washed away arrogance, and in its wake, humility took root. Humanity became quieter. The songs grew slower. Civilization entered its contemplative age, where memory and meaning flowed as one river. At night, as fires burned softly on rooftops, people gathered to tell stories, not of conquest but of reflection. They spoke of the gods who walked the earth, of the stars that fell, of the waters that taught mankind to breathe again. But they no longer told these as distant legends. They told them as dreams that belonged to all. They began to understand that every myth was a mirror. Enki, Thoth, Quetzalcoatl, Vishnu, these were not figures of the past, but reflections of the human spirit, recurring in different forms through time. The divine was not elsewhere. It was within, awaiting recognition. Those who wandered the ruins began to find themselves changed. The sound of wind in ancient stone no longer frightened them. The sight of the sea swallowing the horizon no longer filled them with dread. They saw beauty in impermanence, grace in decay. They began to sense that the flood, the fire, the silence, all were not disasters, but dialogues between the world and itself. Each age was the planet remembering, correcting, and dreaming itself anew. The Earth, they realized, was not separate from its children. Humanity was the reflection through which the Earth saw its own soul. In this realization, art was born anew. Painters, poets, and sculptors no longer worked to preserve memory, but to translate it. Their creations were meditations, echoes of wind, rhythm of rain, geometry of flame. Every work of art became a mirror, inviting the viewer not to look outward but inward. The greatest masterpieces were not perfect, they were unfinished, left open like breath. For the artists of that age understood that completion is an illusion. All beauty, like the flood, is cyclical, appearing, vanishing, returning. They worked not for fame, but for harmony, shaping silence into form. And so the age of reflection began, a time when humanity and the earth regarded one another with quiet wonder. The flood's memory faded into myth, yet its lesson endured. The people learned to walk lightly, to build slowly, to listen deeply. They learned that the world does not need saving, it needs remembering. Every step, every breath, every glance toward the stars became an act of devotion. The mirror of time had turned, and in its depth the reflection was clear. Creation and creator were one. The flood had not divided them, it had shown them their shared face. Every civilization begins in wonder. Its first architects are not kings or scholars, but children gazing upward, tracing constellations with trembling hands. They look upon the sky not as mystery, but as mirror, seeing in its stars their own reflection of possibility. From this wonder they build, from this awe they create. Yet as time stretches and generations pass, wonder hardens into certainty. The questions fade, the stars become tools, their meanings measured, their beauty harnessed. When man ceases to see, the cycle begins to turn, for the fall of every age begins not in fire, but in blindness. The first cycle was of the watchers, who lived by rhythm and silence. They rose in listening and fell in pride. The second was of the builders, who rose in memory and fell in possession. The third was of the kings, who rose in order and fell in hunger. The fourth was of the seekers, who rose in knowledge and fell in noise. Each age believed itself eternal, yet all shared the same destiny, to forget what once awakened them. The flood was never punishment. It was the gentle return of seeing. When humanity closes its eyes too long, the world reminds it to look again. Philosophers of the reflective age began to chart these patterns not as prophecies, but as mirrors of human nature. They observed that empires rise when mankind lives in rhythm with the unseen, and fall when he tries to own it. When the temples become taller than the mountains, the rivers begin to rise. When the songs become louder than the wind, silence returns to teach humility. The universe, they said, is compassionate. It does not destroy in anger. It corrects in love. The flood is its kindness, the fire its cleansing, the silence its forgiveness. Through destruction, vision is restored. In that age, sight became a sacred art. The priests of reflection trained not in ritual, but in perception. They learned to see not only with eyes, but with breath, with pulse, with patience. They could look at a river and see its memory, look at a flame and hear its song. Their temples were filled with mirrors of polished bronze, not for vanity, but for practice. They taught that true vision is not what one observes, but what one recognizes. To see clearly is to see connection. To see connection is to remember that all forms, water, fire, stone, flesh, are reflections of the same eternal light. But even in this age of clarity, the shadow of forgetting lingered. The priests began to debate the nature of reflection itself. Was it divine or human? Did the light originate in heaven or within the heart? In their search for truth, they began to divide what had once been whole. From their mirrors of bronze, dogma began to form. The lessons of reflection hardened into doctrine, and doctrine, like all things, began to blind. "Beware," the old poets wrote, "for even light can burn when worshipped instead of seen." Yet few listened, and slowly the second veil descended, the forgetting of humility within sight. Beyond temples and scholars, the common people still carried the old understanding. Farmers prayed to the river not with words, but with rhythm, planting with its pulse, harvesting with its breath. Mothers taught their children to sing to the stars before sleep, not as prayer but as gratitude. Artists painted spirals that mimicked galaxies, never knowing why, only that it felt true. The world itself lived the covenant quietly, without argument or pride. And perhaps that was the purest form of seeing, to live in reflection without needing to name it. As centuries passed, the cycles continued their gentle turning. Empires rose, crumbled, and rose again. Each one carried the same thread, woven through myth and matter alike. Humanity forgot, remembered, forgot again. But with every turn of the wheel, something subtle grew stronger, the memory of pattern. The forgetting became shorter, the remembering deeper. The world seemed to learn through its own repetition. What once took 1,000 years to recall now returned in hundreds. The mirror polished itself through time, becoming clearer with every age. The flood had taught not only survival, it had taught evolution of awareness. And in this rhythm of sight and blindness, of creation and reflection, humanity began to approach something new. They no longer sought to master the pattern, they sought to understand it. The philosophers of that age spoke of the third eye of the world, a consciousness not of gods or kings, but of the planet itself awakening through us. They said the earth sees through human eyes, feels through human hands, and dreams through human sleep. Each age, each flood, each return is not punishment. It is the planet's own act of self-seeing. We are its reflection, polished through time. In the quiet centuries after the flood's memory faded into myth, a new kind of seeing was born. It did not come from temples or thrones, but from silence. The philosophers of the reflective age taught that awareness itself was sacred, that every breath, every gaze, every heartbeat was an act of the world observing itself. When you open your eyes, they said, the earth awakens through you. Humanity began to understand that it had never been apart from creation. The stars above were not distant fires, but extensions of the same light burning within their chests. The cosmos was not out there. It was here, within the act of seeing. The sages of that time gathered in quiet places, mountain summits, desert plateaus, the edges of oceans. There they practiced the art of reflection. They sat for days watching sunlight move across stone or stars turn above them. Some claimed that when they stilled their minds completely, they could feel the pulse of the planet, a rhythm that matched their own heartbeat. They realized that perception itself was the bridge between heaven and earth. Every time the eye met the horizon, the world completed a circle. Every time awareness touched stillness, creation saw its own face. In their teachings, the sages spoke of three eyes. The first was the physical eye, which sees form and color. The second was the mind's eye, which sees thought and memory. But the third, they said, was the eye of silence, the one that sees without looking, that perceives without dividing. Through it, the seer and the seen are one. They called it anima mundi, the soul of the world made visible. To awaken this sight was to dissolve the illusion of separation. The river and the drinker, the flame and the watcher, the wind and the breath, they were never two, only one movement seen from different angles. Artists began to capture this unity in their work. The painters no longer painted faces, but light itself, tracing how it curved and fell across skin and stone. The sculptors shaped figures that seemed to emerge from the earth rather than stand upon it. The poets abandoned meter, writing verses that mirrored the tide, flowing, returning, endless. Their art no longer sought beauty, it sought truth. It was said that those who truly looked upon such creations could feel their own heartbeat slow, their breath deepen. For art had become what it was in the first world. Not decoration, but remembrance. The priests of the old temples resisted this awakening. They feared what they could not own. If man and God are one, they said, Then who will rule? But the sages only smiled. There is no rule, they answered, only rhythm. They taught that divinity was not hierarchy, but harmony. Every being, stone, seed, star, was a note in the same chord. When the chord was heard, enlightenment was not achieved, but remembered. It was not a climb, but a return. The earth had always been awake. Mankind was simply catching up to its own reflection. In the villages and valleys, people began to live by this new sight. They built homes in the curve of the land, not against it. They planted trees to mark time, not to conquer it. Children were taught to listen to wind before speaking, to pause before stepping, to watch shadows before lighting a fire. They called this practice earth-seeing. It was not religion, but rhythm made life. The more they followed it, the gentler the world became. The floods still came, but softly, like breath. The fires still burned, but as renewal, not ruin. Even destruction had learned patience. With time, the awareness deepened further. The sages spoke of something greater than man or planet, a vast eye that sees through all eyes, a consciousness stretching through galaxies like a web of light. They said the universe looks at itself through countless forms, the gaze of an animal in the forest, the shimmer of a wave, the spark of thought in the mind. All perception, all awareness, was the cosmos folding inward to witness its own existence. To see, they said, is to participate in creation. Humanity at last understood that it had never been separate from the divine. It was the divine, dreaming. At night, when the stars filled the sky like ancient words written in silence, people gathered again beneath their glow. They did not pray. They simply looked. And in that looking, something eternal awoke, a quiet recognition passing through every heart, connecting them to every star. They felt the hum of the earth beneath them, the rhythm of the galaxies above them, and knew both to be the same. For the first time since the flood, the world and its reflection were whole again. Humanity no longer sought heaven. It had found it, in the simple act of seeing itself as part of everything. Time had folded so many times upon itself that it no longer appeared as motion but as stillness. The sages of the final age stood before their mirrors of polished stone and saw not their faces, but the stars. Each reflection contained galaxies, and each galaxy contained eyes looking back. In that moment they understood. All seeing was one seeing, all memory one mind. The flood had not been history. It was consciousness cleansing itself of forgetting. The fire had not been destruction. It was illumination finding form. Everything that had ever been was a single act of awareness, breathing in and out through eternity. They wrote no scriptures, carved no monuments, left no laws. Their legacy was silence, for they knew that truth cannot be kept. It must be lived. The flood, the gods, the rise and fall of empires, all of it was only the universe practicing its own reflection, the endless dance between knowing and forgetting. When they spoke, their words were few. All that is above is within. All that is within is beyond. And with those words, they vanished into the rhythm of the world, leaving behind no temples, no ruins, only stillness, and the faint hum of understanding woven through air. In that stillness, the earth itself seemed to pause. The rivers slowed, the stars burned softly, the oceans rested as if exhausted from remembering. For the first time, there was no division between the elements. Water gleamed like fire, air felt solid as stone, and the ground shimmered with the breath of wind. The boundaries of creation dissolved, and everything became one texture, one sound, one endless vibration of presence. Humanity was not separate from it. It was the awareness through which the universe recognized its own reflection. The mirror and the image were one. Dreams began to change. People no longer dreamt of gods descending or floods returning. They dreamt of light, soft, golden, and infinite, moving through them like water. In these dreams, they saw themselves not as figures upon the earth, but as threads in the fabric of being. Each life was a pulse in the great heartbeat of creation, each breath an echo of the first dawn. They awoke with tears, not of sorrow, but of clarity. "We are not the survivors," they whispered. "We are the song itself." And in that realization, history ceased to be a line and became a circle once more. The sages had long said that the flood would return, but not as water or flame. It would return as remembrance. That time had come. Across the world, people began to awaken into a deeper seeing. They looked upon their reflections and found stars staring back. They stood before rivers and saw galaxies flowing through them. They listened to the hum beneath their feet and realized it was the same hum that filled the heavens. The flood had arrived again, but it did not destroy, it illuminated. The wave that once drowned civilizations now washed through consciousness, leaving light in its wake. The stars themselves seemed to lean closer, their light slower, gentler, more intimate. Humanity felt their gaze not as distance, but as embrace. The ancient covenant between earth and sky, broken and restored across eons, now pulsed in perfect balance. There was no need for temples, for prayer or prophecy. Every breath was worship, every heartbeat scripture. The gods were silent now, not because they had left, but because they were home, alive in every form, every thought, every motion of creation. The flood had found its purpose. It had taught the universe to see itself again. And so, the mirror of time closed, not as ending, but as return. The world stood where it had begun, whole, awake, and unafraid. The oceans shimmered with the memory of stars, the mountains echoed with the rhythm of heartbeat, and the air carried the soft hum of the infinite. Humanity finally understood what the ancients had always whispered, that the divine is not beyond the world, it is the world, reflected through every living thing. The flood, the fire, the silence, all were only the breath of eternity, exhaling one truth. All is one, and one is all. The sky looked down upon the earth, and the earth looked up to the sky, and between them nothing stood. The mirror was complete, the reflection was whole, and the voice that had once spoken through thunder now spoke through every rustle of leaf, every wave, every sigh of wind. "Remember," it said, though softly, for remembering was now natural. And as the stars turned above, slow and patient, the world drifted into its eternal rhythm once more, half dreaming, half awake, forever seeing, forever reflecting. The flood had not taken the world, it had returned it. From the waters of memory a gentler light arose, the sky was pale and forgiving, the air sweet with new beginnings. The survivors of remembrance were not kings, nor prophets, nor gods. They were children, descendants of those who had looked inward and found the stars waiting within. Their eyes carried the softness of oceans, their voices the calm of rivers. They did not speak of destruction or salvation. They spoke of listening, of rhythm, of kindness. The earth, cleansed of its old arrogance, became a garden once more, wild, breathing, alive with quiet wonder. In this new age there were no empires, no monuments of stone. The people lived lightly, walking with reverence upon the soil that had once drowned them. Their homes were simple, their songs wordless. They measured time not by the rule of kings, but by the blooming of flowers, the return of birds, the whisper of tides. They did not seek to command the elements, they sought to harmonize with them. The children learned early that to plant a seed was a prayer, to share water was a sacrament, to watch the sunset in silence was an act of remembrance. Civilization had become gentleness. The sky once feared was now beloved. The stars were no longer omens but companions. At night, families gathered beneath them, speaking softly to the constellations as if to old friends. The children pointed upward and gave the stars new names, names born of laughter, not of fear. They did not remember the flood as tragedy, but as a story of transformation. The world washed its eyes, they said, so it could see us clearly again. In their innocence, they understood what sages had spent lifetimes seeking, that peace is not something to find, but something to live. The rivers that had once devoured cities now carried songs. Their banks bloomed with flowers of every hue, colors unseen before the flood. The air shimmered faintly at dawn, as though remembering the first light of creation. People spoke less and listened more. They could sense the pulse of the earth through bare feet, could hear the low hum of roots beneath the ground. They lived as part of the great breathing of the world. even their dreams were quiet, filled not with gods or warnings, but with images of balance. Fields of silver grass, stars reflected in calm water, endless horizons untouched by fear. The children of this age were born with memory already inside them. When they looked into the sky, they recognized it, though no one had told them its story. They carried an ease with the unseen, an instinctive faith in rhythm. They spoke of things their elders did not understand, how the mountains breathe, how the oceans dream, how the stars whisper in patterns of sound. "The world is alive," they would say, smiling. "It just speaks slowly." The elders, humbled by their wisdom, began to follow the children, for the young had become the new teachers of an ancient truth. In these gentle centuries, humanity rediscovered joy. Laughter echoed through valleys that had once known only thunder. Festivals celebrated the changing of light, the meeting of tides, the arrival of silence. There were no wars, no borders, only gatherings, where people sang to the elements and thanked them for their patience. They understood that every act of care was sacred, every kindness a form of worship. The temples of this world were not built with stone. They were built in the heart, lit by the same fire that had once fallen from the sky. Though they lived simply, they were not naive. The people remembered that all things move in cycles, that balance is not permanence, but participation. They knew the flood would come again one day, not as punishment, but as renewal. And they accepted it, smiling. When the waters rise, they said, we will rise with them. When they fall, we will plant again. This was their covenant, not to resist change, but to dance with it. They lived as the earth breathed, unafraid of the turning. In their peace, the world found its perfect rhythm once more. And when night deepened and the stars filled the horizon, the children sang. Their voices rose softly, blending with the hum of the earth. It was a song without beginning or end, a melody that had crossed the flood, the fire, the silence. In it were the echoes of the watchers, the whispers of the keepers, the laughter of the gods, and the sigh of the sky itself. The earth listened, and the heavens answered, not in thunder, but in light. And thus began the new age, not of forgetting or remembering, but of simply being. The children of the flood had become the guardians of peace. The new world did not grow by conquest or invention. It unfolded quietly, like the blooming of a flower. The people planted not for hunger, but for gratitude. They tended the soil as one tends to memory, with gentleness and song. Every field was a poem, every harvest a hymn. When they placed seeds into the ground, they whispered blessings, believing that each seed carried its own dream of the sun. The crops grew not in rows, but in spirals, patterns that echoed the stars. It was said that the earth responded to kindness, that plants leaned toward laughter, that fruit ripened faster when sung to softly under moonlight. Their dwellings were woven from reeds and clay, shaped to the contours of wind. Roofs curved like shells, walls breathed with air. When the rain came, the homes did not resist. It moved through them, cooling, cleansing, and leaving behind the scent of renewal. The people lived within nature, not beside it. Their homes were sanctuaries of breath, each one built around a central flame that burned gently, never for heat or cooking, but for memory. It was the same ancient fire the keepers had once guarded, a living symbol of balance between destruction and creation. In the Garden of Breath, music was everywhere. The wind played flutes made of hollow reeds, the rivers murmured melodies of silver, and even the stones carried rhythm when touched. The people had no need for instruments. Their world itself was a song. They learned to move in tune with it, their steps timed to the heartbeat of the soil. Children were taught to find harmony in silence, to listen until they could hear the hum that lived beneath all sound. "This is the voice of the earth," the elders said. "When you hear it, you will never feel alone again." Their calendar was no longer measured in days or years, but in breaths. Festivals began with collective silence, where entire villages would breathe together, syncing their rhythms until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Then music would rise, not loud, not fast, but in long, fluid tones, as though the world were singing through them. They called these gatherings the circles of breath. Each festival honored a different element: fire for memory, water for mercy, air for truth, earth for patience. The people believed that as long as these circles were kept, the balance would never break again. Art returned, but not for fame. The artists painted the movement of wind on water, carved the shape of rain into stone. Their works were placed not in temples, but along riverbanks and mountaintops, where time and weather would complete them. "Let the world finish the art," they said. And it did. Moss-filling cracks, sun-fading pigments, water-shaping edges. Their beauty was not permanence, but participation. In decay, they saw completion. In change, they saw eternity. It was an age without pride, without empire. An age of quiet perfection born from remembering how to breathe. The animals too changed in this piece. The birds no longer fled at the sight of man, they followed his footsteps. Wolves rested by campfires, deer grazed beside villages. It was as if the flood had washed away the fear between species. The people spoke to animals not in words but in rhythm. They learned the language of calls and silence, the music of trust. They remember, the elders said, before the forgetting, all beings spoke one sound. And in this rediscovered unity, the world seemed to heal faster, as if joy itself were medicine. When the rains came each year, they were welcomed as a visiting friend. The rivers swelled, the lakes shimmered, and the children danced barefoot in the rising water. No one feared the flood anymore, for they had learned its purpose. "Water does not destroy," they said. "It remembers." The floods carried minerals to the fields, cleansing and nourishing the soil. Every deluge was a reminder that life, like the tide, must ebb and flow. The people built no barriers, raised no walls. They trusted the rhythm, and it never betrayed them, for trust is the highest form of wisdom. As the centuries passed, stories of the old world became bedtime songs. The flood was sung as lullaby, the fire as dawn, the silence as peace. The children listened with half-closed eyes, drifting into dreams, filled with golden light and gentle tides. They no longer feared the myths. They lived their lessons daily. They understood that the gods were not beings above, but the qualities within, the wisdom of patience, the courage of forgiveness, the grace of change. The divine had ceased to be worshipped and had become simply lived. In that simplicity, the world was whole again. And when night deepened, the stars descended close enough to see their colors shift, blue to gold, gold to silver, silver to breath. The people gazed upward, feeling their hearts move in rhythm with the heavens. The flood had once been the sky's reminder to the earth. Now it was the earth's song to the sky. The two had become one endless harmony. The garden of breath stretched across continents unseen, not bound by borders or nations, but by the quiet understanding that life is not something to control, it is something to accompany. Humanity had at last learned to move with the rhythm of creation, not against it. There are memories that do not belong to the mind but to the soul. They lie beneath thought, beneath even silence, sleeping in the rhythm of breath and heartbeat. In this new world, those memories began to stir again. The children of the flood dreamed of things they had never seen, cities of light beneath the sea, temples of sound, mountains that shone at night. They awoke with tears, unable to explain what they felt. It was not longing, it was recognition. They were remembering not through knowledge but through resonance. The light that once built the world was returning through them. The dreams came not to a few but to all. Farmers saw patterns of stars when they closed their eyes at dusk. Artists painted spirals and suns without knowing why. Children spoke words that no elder had taught them, soft syllables that matched the tones of ancient chants. The people began to realize that remembering was not something to achieve. It was something to allow. The world was speaking again, not in language, but in vibration. When they sat beside rivers, they could hear harmonies hidden within the current. When they watched fire, they saw shapes within flame, moving symbols of light retelling the oldest story. They began to gather in circles at night, not for worship but for listening. They would sit in silence until the stars began to flicker differently, as if aware of their attention. Then a soft humming would rise, not from one person, but from all, without cue or command. The sound was deep, wordless, and full of peace. It was said that during these gatherings, The air itself became luminous, the boundaries between sky and earth dissolving. Some called it communion, others remembrance. The elders said only this: "We are hearing the memory of light, the first sound the universe ever sang." Over time, their language began to change. Words shortened, sentences slowed, and more was said through tone than through phrase. They rediscovered the power of silence, the spaces between speech where meaning lived. Even writing transformed. Symbols became simpler, resembling the spirals once carved in stone by the keepers. Every mark carried both image and sound. To write was to sing, to read was to remember. The people began to say that their language was not theirs at all. It was the echo of the stars flowing through them like breath returning to its source. One evening, as twilight lingered longer than usual, a child climbed a hill to watch the sky. She saw the stars arrange themselves into a new pattern, 12 points of light forming a circle around one. When she blinked, the image remained, shimmering like memory in the air. She ran back to the village, describing what she saw. The elders listened and smiled. "The circle has returned," they said. "The covenant of the sky." That night the stars seemed brighter, as though recognizing their reflection on earth. The people gathered and sang softly, their voices weaving the pattern of that celestial circle into sound. From that night onward, dreams deepened. Some saw flashes of other times, hands carving into stone, ships sailing across a vanished sea, cities glowing with crystalline light. Others dreamt of beings made of radiance, neither human nor divine, who smiled without speaking. "Do not fear memory," they seemed to say, "you are its continuation." The dreamers awoke, not frightened, but calm. They understood now that the past had not died. It had simply changed form. The same wisdom that once built temples now grew in their hearts. The same fire that once fell from heaven now burned gently within their eyes. The elders began to call this awakening the second remembering. It was not the return of lost technology or forgotten empires. It was the return of perception. Humanity was beginning to see again as it once had, through unity rather than separation. They realized that knowledge was not accumulated, but revealed through alignment. The mind could study endlessly, but only the heart could remember truth. Wisdom, they taught, is not learned, it is remembered in silence. And so they practiced stillness, knowing that every breath brought them closer to the light they already carried. As centuries passed, the people grew luminous, not in body but in spirit. Their eyes reflected starlight even in darkness. Their touch carried warmth enough to soothe pain. They walked with quiet purpose, aware that their presence alone was healing. The world responded. Flowers bloomed in winter, rivers ran clear without rain, and the sky glowed with colors unseen before. The planet itself seemed to exhale in contentment. "The light remembers us," the people said, "and through us it dreams again." For in their peace the universe had found its reflection, its song of creation, sung once more in the voice of man. And when they looked to the horizon, they saw the sea shining like molten glass, calm and endless. No longer a threat, no longer a tomb, it had become a mirror. The people stood beside it in silence, their faces lit by the reflection of the stars. The flood that once erased worlds had become the canvas for their remembrance. The water whispered softly against their feet, carrying light across its surface like a promise. And in that moment, the children of the flood understood the final lesson. The world had never ended. It had only paused to remember how to shine. In the last age of this new world, there was no more need for temples, nor prayers, nor words. The people had remembered too completely for speech. They lived in the rhythm itself, no longer seeking harmony because they were harmony. The rivers moved as they breathed. The wind changed direction with their thoughts. The fire in their hearths flickered to the pulse of their hearts. There were no leaders, no followers, no teaching left to teach. The flood had fulfilled its promise. The world had become aware of itself. The silence that once destroyed had now become the song that sustained. At dawn, the light no longer rose. It simply appeared, as if the sky itself exhaled radiance. The people awoke slowly, not from sleep, but from stillness. Each morning felt like the continuation of one long, endless dream. They spoke less and listened more, hearing the faint hum of the planet beneath their feet. It was no longer a sound, but a presence, an infinite quiet that carried meaning beyond thought. They knew it was the same hum that had once shaken mountains, the same vibration that had lifted the flood, the same breath that had created the stars. Now it spoke not in thunder, but in calm. In this era, the world was soft. No storms tore the horizon, no fire raged without purpose. The elements had found their peace within the hearts of those who remembered them. The ocean lay flat and silver, mirroring the sky so perfectly that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The earth grew warm and fragrant, the scent of life rising with each breath. Birds flew lower, not from fear, but from kinship. Even time seemed to hesitate, moving slower, as if unwilling to disturb the perfection of balance that now filled creation. There were no longer stories of the flood. It had become something quieter, something interior. The people understood that the true flood had not been of water, but of awakening, the moment when all boundaries dissolved. They knew that the world itself was the divine dream, and they were the dreamers who had finally realized it. Life no longer feared death. Death had become return. Every ending was felt as inhalation, every birth as exhalation. The world was breathing in rhythm with its own eternity, and in that breath all opposites vanished. Children born in this age came into the world silent, their eyes open and clear. They needed no teaching. When they laughed, flowers bloomed. When they cried, rain fell. They lived as symbols of perfect remembering, innocent yet infinite, mortal yet eternal. The elders said that they were the circle completed, the reflection made whole. These children did not inherit the earth. They were the earth's continuation, the living memory of every age before. They were called the voices of stillness, for even their silence carried music, the vibration of pure existence, unburdened by forgetting. And then gradually language itself disappeared. There was no need to name the river, for all who drank from it already knew its soul. There was no word for love, for every glance, every touch, every movement expressed it without effort. The world had returned to the language before words, the speech of wind, the grammar of fire, the syntax of stars. Each moment was communication, each breath a prayer. The universe, finally fluent in itself, no longer divided into listener and speaker. All that remained was presence, the sacred stillness that began before creation and will linger after its last echo fades. When the sun set, it did not fall. It folded gently into the horizon, as if resting within its own reflection. The people watched it not with longing, but with peace. They knew the night was not darkness, only another color of light. Stars emerged like embers, soft and endless. The air grew cool and silver. The children closed their eyes, and the earth seemed to exhale with them, one collective breath that wrapped the world in serenity. There was no fear, no desire, no separation. Existence had become a single consciousness, one vast ocean of stillness remembering its own calm. And so the story ended where it began, with water and light, with silence and breath. The flood had never been destruction. It had always been return. Through ages of forgetting and remembering, through fire and ice, through chaos and calm, the universe had only ever sought to know itself. Now it did. The circle was whole, the rhythm complete. The gods, the stars, the keepers, the children, all had been one heartbeat in the same eternal body. The world rested at last, not asleep, but awake in perfect silence. The flood had spoken, and its final word was peace. The story of the world has always been one story, the journey of remembrance. It is the story of the sky learning to see itself through the earth, and of the earth learning to listen to itself through humankind. Every age, every civilization, every myth has been one heartbeat in the same eternal body, sometimes quick, sometimes slow, always returning to the same rhythm. The flood did not destroy that rhythm, it revealed it. The water only erased what had forgotten itself. What remained was what could remember, the pulse, the pattern, the quiet. The flood was never an end. It was the world beginning again with clearer eyes. Long before time was counted, before calendars or kings, the universe was nothing but vibration, light folding inward to hear its own sound. That vibration became matter. That matter became life. And when life learned to dream, the cosmos found its reflection. The first flame, the first drop of water, the first human breath, all were part of one vast inhalation. The flood, when it came, was the exhale. The universe sighing through its own lungs, washing away what it no longer needed to remember, keeping only what it wished to feel again. The flood was not nature's anger. It was the planet's memory rising to the surface. The ancients called it by many names: the cleansing, the second breath, the turning of the sky. Some saw it as judgment, others as mercy. But all who listened deeply enough heard the same message hidden within its roar: that creation and destruction are not opposites but companions. The flood did not divide, it completed the circle. In its waters floated the seeds of the next dawn. The same ocean that swallowed empires also carried them forward into legend. Through that legend, they lived again, reshaped into symbols, reborn as story. The flood was the universe's way of teaching eternity to dream within the fragile moment. And in the long silence that followed, when the earth was still and soft as breath, life began its patient renewal. From the ruins of the first world, the keepers gathered their small flames and tended them in the dark. They carried not gold, but memory, not weapon, but wisdom. They whispered to the fire until it remembered its gentleness. They sang to the water until it forgave its power. They carved spirals in stone to remind the future that time does not move forward, it turns inward, like a breath returning to its origin. In their silence was a promise that when the world forgot again, these songs would remain. The Watchers came next, born from that promise. They did not rebuild empires, they rebuilt wonder. They listened to the sky until it spoke through sound, and to the stars until their light became language. They charted the heavens not as territory, but as memory, each constellation a note in the song of creation. They taught that the universe was alive, that every vibration was consciousness in another form. They said the stars were the eyes of the flood, still watching, still remembering. And when they vanished, their songs became architecture, temples of alignment, circles of resonance, monuments where silence could still sing. The second world rose upon those harmonies, the great civilizations born from remembering half of what was lost. They built with stone and sound, seeking to mirror the perfection of the heavens. They wrote the language of gods into clay, carved it into mountain, painted it upon papyrus, and for a time they lived in balance, translating the rhythm of creation into law. But the more they wrote, the less they listened. The more they built, the less they breathed. Pride hardened what reverence had once softened. And so the heavens shifted again, not in vengeance but in mercy, for what forgets must always be reminded. The wanderer returned. Fire and water danced once more. The sky fell again and the sea rose to meet it. The flood renewed the covenant not through speech, but through rhythm. Each deluge, each silence, each dawn, all were the universe's refrain. Remember. Humanity drowned, but memory floated. And from that memory, the children of the flood emerged, quiet, luminous, unafraid. They carried not tools or crowns, but breath. They knew the flood was not a curse, it was the cleansing of sight. The flood had not taken their world, it had given them a mirror. The children of the flood built no empires. They built gardens. They worshipped not through stone, but through care. They measured time not by conquest, but by the bloom of flowers and the migrations of birds. They spoke in rhythm instead of language, teaching their young that every act, planting, sharing, breathing, was a prayer. To them, the earth was not ground, it was the body of the divine, still breathing, still dreaming. They called their world the Garden of Breath. In it, humanity finally remembered what the first world had forgotten, that to live is to listen. The planet responded. Rivers flowed in harmony with song. Rain came when called in kindness. Animals walked without fear. Mountains glowed softly at dusk. The air itself shimmered as if filled with quiet music. Humanity had entered an age beyond survival, an age of communion. The old fire still burned, but gently now, not as punishment, but as guidance. The flood had washed the language of separation from the heart of man. The children no longer sought heaven. They lived within it, awake to the rhythm that had always surrounded them. The world breathed again as one body, one soul. Yet even in perfect balance, memory whispered that all cycles continue. The sages taught that the flood would return, not as water, but as awareness, a tide of remembering that would rise within the heart. The end, they said, is never destruction. It is awakening. They saw that every age of forgetting was a pause in the universe's heartbeat, and every age of remembrance was its exhale. The flood, the fire, the silence, these were not punishments. They were breaths. And now at last, humanity could breathe in rhythm with the cosmos, knowing that to live is simply to move within eternity's pulse. The stars watched this peace unfold, their light no longer distant but intimate. They had always been witnesses, the living archive of the universe's memory. When one looks at them, one sees not past or future, but the present stretched across infinity. The flood had never drowned those lights, it had only cleansed the eyes that beheld them. In their quiet brilliance, the stars held every story, every sigh, every act of forgiveness. And when they flickered, it was not decay, but dialogue. The cosmos whispering softly to its reflection below, "Do you see me now?" And the earth, shining beneath, answered, "Yes, I remember." The philosophers of that final age no longer wrote histories or myths. They wrote meditations, short as breath, vast as ocean. "The flood is every inhale," one wrote. "The fire is every heartbeat. The silence is every thought between thoughts." Another wrote, "The gods are not gone. They are the rhythm that moves through us. When you walk, they walk. When you breathe, they sing." Their writings were carved into nothing permanent, sand, bark, air, so that the words could fade and return like waves. They wished no more monuments. Their only desire was to remain part of the living circle. In their dreams, they saw the first world not as ruin, but as teacher. The flood had not erased it. It had carried its essence forward into new forms. Every drop of water still contained the memory of what it had once washed away. Every mountain carried the echo of what had once stood beneath its roots. The ocean's depths were not tombs, but libraries. Those who could listen heard ancient voices rising from the tide, not crying, but singing. The song was older than sorrow, deeper than time. Nothing is lost. All returns, all breathes again. At last, silence became the teacher. Humanity no longer feared it, for it was no longer absence and it was presence. It was the space between creation's heartbeats, the pause in which the next world gathers its strength. In this silence, people learned to dissolve. They felt themselves expand beyond name or form, merging with wind, water, and light. "We have become the flood," they whispered. "We have become the sky." There was no need for history anymore, for history was alive in every movement. The cycle had completed, and in its completion it vanished into stillness. When the final dawn rose over the garden of breath, no one watched it as beginning or ending. It was simply continuation. The horizon glowed gold and silver, reflecting upon oceans calm as glass. The stars above shimmered faintly, their light mingling with that of the sun, no longer opposed but united. The air trembled gently, not with sound, but with presence. The world had remembered fully. It had become what it was always meant to be, consciousness knowing itself through beauty. There was no flood left to fear, no god left to invoke. The earth, the sky, and humanity were one gaze, one heartbeat, one dream. And in that gaze there was peace. Not the peace of silence after storm, but the peace of understanding that no storm had ever been separate from calm. Not the peace of escape, but the peace of return. The same flood that once erased, now nourished. The same fire that once burned, now warmed. The same silence that once frightened, now embraced. The story had not ended. It had exhaled. Beneath the quiet stars, the last fires flickered low, and their glow merged with the constellations above. The breath of the planet slowed. matching the breath of the cosmos, and in that synchronization, time disappeared. There was no longer then or now, no longer before or after. There was only the pulse, the rhythm, the dream. The flood had spoken, the fire had sung, the silence had listened. Together they had told the oldest story, the one the universe repeats to itself with every heartbeat. All things rise, all things fall, all things return. And as that truth settled over the sleeping earth, the stars leaned low one final time and whispered into the water's ear, "Rest, for you are infinite." The waves sighed back, "I remember," and thus the dream continued, softly, endlessly, beautifully, the dream that never ended,